So, welcome everyone. My name is Scott Rogers, and on behalf of myself and Tim Markham, who's here at the front, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conference, which is entitled Conditions of Mediation, as you know. And indeed, we'd like to really thank you, thank our keynotes, thank our presenters, thanking all of the other participating delegates for coming so very early. But this, for what promises we think to be a stimulating and fairly intensive day. Now, much of what makes the conference go well, we think, are the small things, the things that sort of we don't notice, the things that proceed into the background. So while I'm saying this, what I'd like to do first is just say some thanks to a few people who have helped us, hopefully, pull this event off as smoothly as possible. So I'd like to first of all mention some of our administrative staff in the School of Arts, Sarah Lawrence, Paul McGowan, and Claire Adams, who have been really crucial in helping us with some of the advanced logistical arrangements for this conference. Halbert Howe, who's a PhD student here at Birkbeck, and Mosengo Parva, a recently graduated PhD student from Royal Holloway, who are helping us here today to make the event go smoothly. Mansour Shabak, Graham Holway from Birkbeck's Media Services, who are providing us with, been very flexible in arranging to have the keynote sessions filmed today. And finally, I'd like to extend our thanks to the Philosophy, Theory, and Critique section of the International Communication Association, who have formally sponsored this event as a pre-conference of the ICA conference, which is taking place this week. So, why are we here? First, we might stake a claim, really. And this is that it's become increasingly orthodox to presume that when we're studying and we're theorizing media, that we must pay attention first and foremost to everyday experience. We certainly see this move in ethnographic audience studies, for example, which has sort of questioned the assumption that there's this discrete relationship between media content and audiences. In audience theory, it's become increasingly orthodox to see media forms, media content, technologies as having an indeterminate, multi-dimensional significance within the very rhythms of urban life, or of everyday life. And meanwhile, if we look to studies of digital and network media, this is a field for whom the very question of the notion of audiences itself is significantly undermined as a starting point for thinking or understanding media. But here too is a field for which experience is central, even if that's not the term always used. Because at base this is a field which is interested in the sort of experience afforded by the architectures, the interfaces, the environments of computational network media. So a question that arises for us is, how do we understand media experience? For some, this has been a question that is really addressed primarily empirically. It involves simply attending to or asking people what they do with media. But for others, this isn't enough. The question isn't how do we describe what people do with media, but rather why or what constitutes the conditions of media experience in the first place. So, for example, asking things like, how do political configurations of discourses or inherited dispositions prefigure mediated action? Or how do material arrangements themselves constitute environments for mediated experience? Or again, how do we account for non-human agency? For example, the ways in which software objects not only interact with our perceptions, human perceptions, but also with each other. These kind of questions point to a renewed confidence, we think. Confidence to go beyond simply describing how media, technology, and communication are experienced, but also why they are experienced as they are. And this interest in the very conditions of mediation suggests, if sometimes only implicitly, an emerging interest in the phenomenology of media. Now, phenomenology, at least insofar as we might describe it as the structuring of perception, has seemingly obvious relevance for academic interest in media experience. But its use or invocation in media studies has largely been scattered. And now this could simply reflect the considerable diversity of phenomenological philosophies, phenomenological approaches. But at the same time, there have been recent efforts to rethink phenomenology across the social sciences and humanities, So we think, and we also think your attendance confirms this, that the time is apt to theorize seriously what it might mean to think media phenomenologically. And we're here to be quite open about how we do this. So to put it in the negative, we don't see this today as an occasion to assert disciplinarity or to be particularly canonical. So yes, we are interested in how phenomenological approaches might offer media technology studies, ways of thinking that other approaches cannot, but we're also interested in the limits of phenomenological approaches, whether these be philosophical, theoretical, empirical, or political. Now, if you look at the program we have today, we'll be doing so also from a range of disciplinary perspectives or positions: media theory, audience studies, political theory, metaphysics, software studies, science and technology studies, digital aesthetics, cultural geography, urban studies. So many of us will connect the core thinkers, we think. For example, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre. But others will connect the thinkers who have perhaps looser affiliations with phenomenology per se. Arendt, Bergson, Bourdieu, Deleuze, Ingold, Latour, Whitehead. Indeed, some of the keynotes we have here today, the first group of whom I'm about to introduce. Okay, so as I've mentioned before, this will be an intensive day, not just in ideas, although hopefully mainly in ideas, but also in format. This has been a trade-off of being an ICA pre-conference. The benefit, which I'll begin with, is that we can convene a discussion here in London at a time at which many of you are already here, attending the main ICA conference. But it's also meant that we've been asked to confine the conference to a single day because there is a lot of congestion. Many other conferences have been taking place in the days preceding and also the conference following. And also to finish at 5 p.m. because for those of you who are attending the ICA main conference, that would be your opportunity to go and attend the opening plenary of the main conference, which is at 6 p.m. tonight. But we'd like to make the most out of this intensity that we see unfolding in this event today. And in any case, it's a beginning, it's not an end. One way it will continue, we hope, is in the form of an edited publication stemming from this event. We'll bring this up again in the closing discussion, I think, which, by the way, I think there may be on your program, the room isn't listed, but the closing discussion is here in this same room in B01. But aside from the edited book, this isn't, of course, to mention all the work that all of us will hopefully, presumably be doing and taking forward after this event, which hopefully will be at least partly inspired by some of the things we discuss today. More prosaically, it won't literally end at 5 p.m. because for those of us who are not attending the plenary, we've indicated a pub in your materials, the Marquis Cornwallis, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, which is pinpointed on your map. So from around 5:30 p.m., we will convene there for some further socializing, and I'll certainly lead a group there after the conference. Finally, the conference shouldn't be just confined to this room. And in particular, we'd encourage the extension of our tentacles outwards through live tweeting, for those of you who would like to do that sort of thing. In your delegate pack, we have information on hooking up to the Wi-Fi, but also we've indicated the hashtag that we've been using, which is hashtag ConMed. So if you want to use that, that would be great. We've actually been asked, so there are some people who would be interested in following this event on Twitter to the extent that they can. Okay, so we're going to move to our first keynote panel. We're going to have a slightly different order. So we're going to start first with Graham Harman, then Lisa Parks, and then Patty Scannell. Let me first briefly explain the format. Each keynote will be presenting for 20 minutes, and I'll be fairly strict about that, holding up those annoying little slips of paper that tell you how much time you have left. And after this, we're going to have an opportunity for dialogue and discussion. Initially, what we'll do is, after the keynotes have each given their initial talk, we'll all sit here at the front. The keynotes will have an opportunity first to ask some questions or make further comments on what each other has said, and offer responses, and then we'll open up questions to the audience members. And I would ask, and I'll remind you again, that you state your name and your affiliation when you ask a question, because we are filming this, and it would be good to know who's speaking. Okay, so I'll introduce our first speaker, and I'll keep these introductions brief so we have enough time for discussion. Graham Harman is a professor of philosophy and the associate provost for research administration at the American University of Cairo. He calls his work an object-oriented philosophy. This involves reading Heidegger's tool analysis as a metaphysics of autonomous objects. So this is something that really challenges traditional phenomenological approaches, which tend to be centered on human perception. And for this reason, I think Harman's work has attracted significant interest outside of philosophy itself, including fields like architecture, literature, geography, and of course, media theory. His books include, and he has many, Tool Being, Heidegger and Metaphysics and the Metaphysics of Objects, Prince of Networks, Bruno Latour and Metaphysics, and The Quadruple Object. And today Graham is going to be speaking on the topic of McLuhan and phenomenology. Graham, please. Thank you.
I'm going to need to read this very quickly to fit it into 20 minutes, but I tend to read quickly anyway. McLuhan and phenomenology is one of the most important themes I can think of for present-day philosophy, yet there are specific reasons why many people are not in a good position to see it now. Today I will speak about some of the obstacles to appreciating both McLuhan and phenomenology in the early 21st century, and will also suggest that it is urgent that we circumvent these obstacles so as to put philosophy on a new track. To do so, it will be necessary to begin with some remarks on the state of contemporary philosophy. Following this, I will turn to my main theme roughly halfway through, McLuhan and phenomenology. Our dominant contemporary philosopher is still Immanuel Kant, even though he's been dead for more than 200 years. What was most new in Kant, and what remains new even today, is the relation he emphasizes between depth and surface, the unknowable depth of the noumenal things in themselves, and the accessible phenomenal surface of the things for us. One of the major ways of responding to Kant has been to treat this problem repeatedly as a pseudo-problem. The things in themselves are ridiculed even by many of Kant's admirers, though this ongoing ridicule betrays the fact that everyone knows they must account for reality in some way under penalty of endorsing a full-blown idealism a la Berkeley, of a sort that seems so extravagant that almost no one is willing to defend it. If Berkeley represents pure idealism, and the things in themselves beyond human knowledge represent pure realism, the enterprise of much contemporary philosophy is to thread the needle in some way. The pony must be kept and also sold. We must go beyond the supposed pseudo-problem of realism and idealism. One common method of doing this is the correlationist method, so lucidly diagnosed in 2006 by Quentin Meillassoux, and whose diagnosis provoked the counter-movement of speculative realism in its four basic forms. Correlationism refers to the claim that we cannot think of the world without humans, or humans without the world, but only of the primordial correlation or rapport between them. In short, correlationism agrees with Kant that we cannot know the things in themselves, but remain trapped within the human world correlate, while also denying that it's a trap at all. For even to speak of something outside the correlate is impossible, since we ourselves are doing the speaking, and therefore the human standpoint retains priority, even though so-called humanism is treated with contempt. The argument is a familiar one, and for some reason, and for some, it remains quite compelling. To think of the things in themselves outside thought is supposedly a performative contradiction, since in doing so we claim to be thinking of the unthought. This is what Meillassoux calls the correlationist circle. Now, Meillassoux remarks on ancestrality in the archifossil in his book, of a reality pre-existing the emergence of thought by billions of years, are often misread as if they were meant as a scientific disproof of the human world correlate. But this is by no means the case. Meillassoux accepts the argument of the correlationist circle against all dogmatic access to the things themselves. Namely, we can't think the unthought without turning it into a thought. His appeal to ancestrality and the archifossil are simply meant to show that there is an inherent tension between correlationism and the claims of natural science. And for Meillassoux, this tension must be addressed not simply by asserting that science proves realism, but by doing justice to science from within a correlationist circle that Meillassoux himself accepts. Elsewhere, I have tried to show several reasons why Meillassoux' solution fails. He argues only that mathematics allows us to discover the primary of quality things that can exist, even if no human thought has yet emerged, and even if all human thought is someday exterminated. In other words, it is merely a temporal in itself that can outlast the human lifespan. But insofar as humans and the world both exist currently, there is no in itself beyond the access of thought for Meillassoux. We can know the world directly via the tools of mathematics and the Galilean natural sciences that mathematics makes possible. Whereas Meillassoux accepts the correlationist circle at the start and seeks a complicated argument to escape it, I hold that he never does escape it, since he ends up with a model in which the world is thoroughly penetrable in principle by mathematical tools. Given his inability to account for the fact that knowledge of the real is always a translation, and hence a distortion or transformation of the real, Meillassoux, like the correlationists he criticizes so severely, is in fact an idealist rather than a realist. Another attempt to sidestep the problem of reality can be found in recent philosophies of Hegelian inspiration, such as that of Slavoj Žižek, who is obviously well known here at Birkbeck. For Žižek, who draws on Lacanian psychoanalysis at least as much as Hegelian philosophy, the difference between subject and object is itself generated only by the subject in its difference from itself, in its encounter with the inassimilable traumatic real kernel at the heart of subjective experience. Žižek's philosophical position is every bit as sophisticated as Meillassoux', but it ultimately derives from the same acceptance of the correlationist circle, with its claim that to think of an in-itself outside thought is to fall into a performative or pragmatic contradiction. As Žižek and co-author Marcus Gabriel put it in their 2009 book, Mythology, Madness, and Laughter, German idealism was designed to effectuate a shift from epistemology to a new ontology without simply regressing to a pre-critical metaphysics. But this is a misunderstanding of how pre-critical or pre-Kantian metaphysics did its work. The problem with pre-critical dogmatic metaphysics was its insistence on the direct knowability of things in themselves, such that it offered rational proofs of the finitude or infinity of time and space, the existence or non-existence of God, a smallest particle of matter, or free will. Kant's answer to such dogmatic metaphysics was to insist on a gap between the inherent reality of such things and any access to them. For this reason, there is no performative contradiction at work when Kant holds that there are things in themselves that can be thought but not known, any more than it is a performative contradiction to refer to Prime Minister Cameron by name without being able to specify in exhaustive manner the exact features and motivations of his character. Kant's critique of dogmatism is a critique of the accessibility of the real, not of the existence of it. And the fact that in speaking of the real we are speaking of it does not entail that it cannot be real apart from our speaking. For this reason, it is Meillassoux and Žižek who are the true heirs of dogmatism. I leave out Marcus Gabriel, who has distanced himself somewhat from the claims made in the 2009 book, given their view that we can access the real directly. In fact, the only way to avoid dogmatism is to follow Kant in insisting on a gap between the real and any access to it. Kant's mistake lay not in endorsing finitude, but in making it a special tragic property of human beings, so that only rational beings were haunted by the inaccessibility of the end itself, when the same must hold true of animals, wheat, and colliding stones. In all of these cases, the real is not fully translatable into any relation to the real. This is the central principle of object-oriented philosophy, which might have been defended 2 centuries earlier if Kant had been abandoned in favor of a German realism rather than a German idealism. For further discussion of this point, I'll refer you to my books, since there's other topics now to cover. I'll make one other point about Meillassoux and Žižek, who are full-blown idealists, despite their denial of it, and despite Žižek's misunderstanding of Meillassoux as a sort of dangerous pre-critical realist. It is not accidental that both thinkers call themselves materialists, since materialism is simply idealism with an alibi, as Bruno Latour has nicely noted in a brilliant article that amazingly has only been cited 24 times in its 6 years of existence, despite Latour's international fame. And that's, can we get our materialism back, please, if you don't know that article. Latour's point in this article, which I endorse completely, is that materialism in no way exhausts the real, but simply reduces entities to some particular inadequate model of what they are, whether it be mass, spatio-temporal location, resistance, or in Meillassoux' case, mathematizability. By reducing the thing to its formalizability in material terms, material in scare quotes, we deny the inherent mystery and surprise of things and make them isomorphic with our knowledge of them under ideal intellectual conditions. So, materialism is always a kind of idealism, and that is why I have called for realism without materialism, or Kant without the human privilege, rather than Kant without the limitations on knowledge, which is what Meillassoux and Žižek recommend. Despite the great prestige of materialism on the political left as a tool for annihilating sorcerers, churches, witch doctors, capitalism, and tooth fairies, we must not forget that materialism is philosophically flawed. Rather than being the opposite to idealism, as the Marxist tradition still claims, materialism is perhaps the very incarnation of it. That brings us to McLuhan and phenomenology, who perhaps surprisingly offer us a way out of idealism in both its materialist and non-materialist variants. My thesis concerning McLuhan and phenomenology is simple. Namely, both can be described as media theory, but in a surprising twofold sense that reflects the ambivalence of media themselves. Namely, in a first sense, media are that which hide in the background behind any content, providing the invisible conditions for the visibility of that content. We find this idea everywhere in McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan, but most famously in his slogan that the medium is the message. But we also find this idea in Heidegger, the former crown prince of phenomenology, with his notion that being, or that which withdraws, is always more profound than the legible surface of presence at hand or the stockpiling work of technology. But in a second sense, media are not what withdraws behind all content, but that which enables the very transmission of content. While less conspicuous in McLuhan's work, this idea is no less pivotal for his thinking than the saying that the medium is the message. And this is the idea that we surprisingly find in the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology in 1900. To state this duality in terms of Kantian philosophy, in one sense media theory is about the noumenal background to any explicit content, while in another sense media theory is about the phenomenal space through which all hidden backgrounds communicate. Both senses of mediation are crucial for present-day philosophy, and both require that we abandon the idealism and materialism that dominate the scene at the moment. For this reason, to defend McLuhan is to ask for a new turn in philosophy. McLuhan's basic idea is stated and repeated clearly throughout his breakthrough book of 1964, Understanding Media. The medium is the message, which is to say that the content of any medium is always another medium. For example, the railway accelerated and enlarged the scale of previous human functions, creating totally new kinds of cities and new kinds of work and leisure. This happened whether the railway functioned in a tropical or northern environment and is quite independent of the freight or content of the railway medium. And likewise, whether the electric light is being used for brain surgery or night baseball is a matter of indifference, according to McLuhan. To say that the medium is the message is to say that the surface content of any medium is trivial compared with the changes wrought by the unnoticed background conditions of that medium. McLuhan expands on that point 10 pages later. Our conventional response to all media, namely that it is how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiots. For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts, but alter sense ratios or patterns of perception steadily and without any resistance. For anyone familiar with recent philosophy, there is an obvious parallel with Heidegger. Heidegger, too, is a theorist of the depths rather than the surface. Whereas phenomenology tries to suspend all judgment about the world outside conscious accessibility, Heidegger notes that conscious awareness is a relatively rare case. His question of being as opposed to the question of beings, which on the one hand has to do with unity over against plurality, but more importantly refers to the veiled or concealed character of being over against the manifest presence of beings. For both McLuhan and Heidegger, the deep background conditions of a situation are everything and the surface content of perception is merely derivative. This might seem to lead to a passive attitude on the part of humans, in politics as elsewhere. Heidegger of the later period is often accused, understandably enough, of advocating that we merely wait for the next great epoch of being to send itself rather than engaging in overt political activity. Analogously, McLuhan is often accused of being a technological determinist who sees all deliberate human action as a frivolous playing with content silently dominated by the background media in play at any given moment. Both McLuhan and Heidegger seem to have such allegiance to the depths of the world that they excessively downplay the surface where human decisions unfold. Yet this is not entirely true. In Heidegger's case, for example, being needs human being as its shepherd, allowing it to come to presence in different historical forms. And more than this, for reasons I can't argue in detail this morning, since entities withdraw absolutely from each other, they can only make contact with surfaces or caricatures of each other. The same holds for McLuhan. Media in themselves for McLuhan are so deep that if they were truly beyond all earthly attempts to change them, each medium would remain permanently in force, and the very history of media that McLuhan describes would be impossible. There are actually two ways McLuhan thinks media can change. The first is through the role of artists in the widest sense, in what the later McLuhan calls retrieval. We humans are not helpless as long as there are artists in our midst, for as McLuhan puts it, the serious artist is the only person able to experience technology with impunity, just because the serious artist is an expert aware of the changes in sense perception. Whereas most of us, most of the time, are simply hypnotized by the background effects of technology, the serious artist for McLuhan is able to create an anti-environment that makes the medium itself visible and thereby counter its dangers. The artist can take dead cliches and bring them back to life as active media, which is precisely what retrieval means for McLuhan. If normally the medium is the message, the artist converts message into a new medium. In this way, the supposedly worthless sensual content of the world becomes the gateway to a change in the media themselves. And there's also a second way for McLuhan that the content leads to changes in the ground, one that does not rely on the intermittent genius of serious artists. This is what he calls the reversal of the overheated medium. For McLuhan, cold media are those such as television that lack an explicit detail and thus have the hypnotic effect of provoking involvement by the viewer. Despite the paradoxical term cold, even fire would count as a cold medium, given its vague and flickering form, so conducive to the mesmerization of humans seated near fireplaces. By contrast, hot media are those such as radio that provide total explicit information. Yet McLuhan's tendency to classify certain types of media as inherently hot or cold is countered by an opposite tendency in his books to treat the heat of a given medium as variable, so that it can increase over time. This is how reversal occurs. While email begins as a convenient labor-saving device that eliminates countless trips to the post office, its numerical increase in instant delivery via smartphone means that we are now constantly at the post office, sending and receiving letters. Notice that reversal, just like the serious artist's retrieval, is a matter of the surface. For nothing in the medium structure of email itself entails reversal. Instead, it is email's interaction with other media, such as smartphones or job duties redefined with the expectation of quick response times, that lead email to reverse from a convenience into a crushing burden that we often wish would disappear into the past. If media are deep and unnoticed, media are unable to change or even to interact with us and with each other without the interface of a surface, McLuhan's despised surface of content. No less than Heidegger, McLuhan fails in his efforts to be a thinker exclusively of the depths and has to become a theorist of how the surface manipulates the depth. And this brings us to the other side of the medium. The medium is interface rather than its hidden background condition. We've seen how McLuhan relies on retrieval and reversal as the engine of human history, and thus becomes a champion of decision and accident rather than deep technological determinism. We even saw that Heidegger is forced into the same predicament despite his contempt for visible beings in the plural as ontic, his term of contempt. But the care for the surface is even more evident in the phenomenologist whom Heidegger tried to turn upside down, his teacher Edmund Husserl. For Husserl, there is no question of an inaccessible world lying beyond all possible access, an idea he regards as nonsense. Although Husserl's philosophical motto was to the things themselves, he did not mean Kant's hidden things in themselves, but only the things themselves lying before us already, intentional objects, or as I call them, sensual objects. If they are lying before us already, you might ask, then what is the use of difficult technical philosophy? But this point is the key to Husserl, for unlike the empiricists who took unified objects to be nothing more than nicknames for a series of different appearances to the mind, so that the supposedly same apple at times T1, T2, and T3 would be only closely related through their family resemblances, Husserl discovered a remarkable world of objects that do not lie deeper than consciousness, but do lie deeper than the details they present to us at any given moment, deeper than the Abschattungen or adumbrations through which they are visible to us. Hence the need for the technical apparatus of philosophy. For as Husserl sees it, it is somewhat difficult to determine the essential features of a specific apple that endure through all the shifting perceptions and experiences we have of it. Along with Heidegger's real apple that withdraws more deeply than any encounter with it, there is Husserl's sensual apple that does not withdraw from the mind, since it is always there, but is still easily confused with its shifting accidental properties. What Husserl calls the eidetic reduction is a method for removing these accidental features of the sensual apple and getting direct intuition into its essence, a project that in my opinion inevitably fails, just as I hold that Meillassoux and Zizek's direct access to reality fails. Although Husserl is often bizarrely linked with Kant, what is missing in Husserl, though present in Heidegger, is the Kantian insight into the permanent rift between the things and themselves in any matter of accessibility. Although media theory might be viewed as having only a peripheral interest for philosophy, communication should be seen as the central problem of modern philosophy. Indeed, I've often written about this theme. For theological reasons, some of the early Arab thinkers held that God was the only possible causal medium. When fire seems to burn cotton, it is actually God who burns cotton. The proximity of fire to cotton only provides the occasion for God himself to burn cotton. Although this is easily ridiculed in the post-Enlightenment West, the topic is still taken seriously when it becomes the mind-body problem in Descartes, who also appeals to God, whether sincerely or not, as the medium of communication between the two different kinds of finite substance, mind and body. And it is taken even more seriously when not God, but the human mind is treated as the universal ether of communication between any two distinct entities, as when David Hume treats causation as customary conjunction or habit of the minds, or when Immanuel Kant treats causation as a structure internal to finite human experience. Yet Kant already oversteps these bounds, as his critics noted very early, when he treats causation not just as an internal structure of phenomenal experience, but as the very link between things in themselves and the appearances, as when he says that there cannot be appearances without things that appear, which cause the appearances. Although obviously a contradiction, it is a fruitful one. Contradiction is often the wage we pay to a reality that exceeds the grasp of our theories. The problem with occasionalist theories, as they're called, is not that they make God the causal medium, which the standard atheism of 21st century Western intellectual life requires us to mock. The philosophical problem with occasionalism is not that God was God, but that God was one specific entity allowed to solve a causal problem that arises as soon as we see that entities are deeper than any possible relation to them. Fire cannot touch cotton directly, not because a particular interpretation of the Quran would forbid it, but because no entity can be given unexplained magic communicative powers that are denied to all other entities. But the same goes for the human mind, as in human Kant, which simply posits the mind as a causal glue while failing to address what happens when object touches object in the absence of any human mind. The gap between non-communicating objects must be bridged in such a way that it can happen anywhere, though with some difficulty, not by appealing to a divine or human king to solve the problem by fiat once and for all. Last paragraph. In one sense, McLuhan joins Heidegger in treating the medium as a background deeper than any possible content, any possible surface manifestation. For McLuhan, the deep structure of the television medium withdraws deeper than the content of any television program, while for Heidegger, the hammer is deeper than any hammer effects until it breaks and comes to our view. But in another sense, McLuhan joins Husserl in seeing the surface of the world as the place where an entity exists in tension with its own shifting accidental properties. Is the medium an inaccessible deep structure, or is it a surface of communication where one thing easily touches another? Which model is correct? The answer is that both must be equally correct in order for the world to function as it does. There is a world in itself, just as Kant says, given that no access to a thing ever gives us the thing in itself, but inevitably translates or distorts it. Yet there is also a sensual world, a world of images and simulacra, that cannot be eliminated in favor of its causal underpinnings. Just as the link between the real medium postal mail and the real medium email is the supposedly superficial realm of surface content, the link between two images is the real medium that I am in each case myself, and that each object is in each case. Two real objects are mediated by the sensual, and two sensual objects are mediated by the real, just as only the opposite poles of magnets can touch without repulsion. The medium is the message, and the message is in turn the medium. Whereas idealism and its bastard child materialism simply eliminate the problem of communication by calling it a pseudo-problem, realism without materialism recognizes communication as the central problem of contemporary philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Lisa Parks. Right. Now, Lisa Parks is professor of film and media studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Lisa's research explores different uses of satellite, computer, and television technologies in a transnational context, including topics ranging from secret satellites to drones, and from the mapping of orbital space to political uses of Google Earth, which I think she might talk a bit about today. Her work is highly interdisciplinary. It engages with a range of fields, including geography, art, international relations, as well as you would imagine, communication studies. Her books include Cultures in Orbit, Satellites in the Televisual, and Down-to-Earth Satellite Technologies, Industries, and Cultures, which is co-edited with James Swash. And quite a few others in preparation, actually, if you take a look at her website. Now, I'm just going to make sure I get the screen on for you. Lisa's going to speak today around signal territories, broadcast infrastructure, Google Earth, and phenomenology. Lisa.
Okay, is this the mic that I'm speaking into? Test, test, yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Scott and Tim, for inviting me. It's great to be here. I just want to say that I'm not a philosopher, I'm a media scholar. I'm going to be presenting a much more kind of applied study today. And this is part of a longer article that was developed for a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Communication, a special issue on Earth observing media. That was edited by Chris Russell, who's also doing a panel at ICA on Wednesday, organized around the special issue. Right. So this image is a screen capture from the Earth observing platform known as Google Earth. It shows the United States with a layer called FCC Info activated and reveals the country to be one giant signal territory. A landscape defined not only by its sovereign boundaries, but that is blanketed with color-coded icons and lines, representing an array of broadcast facilities, including transmission towers, repeaters, transponders, links, and antenna. Such sites are vital to the functioning of broadcast systems and are integral to the production of media cultures. These transmission facilities did not emerge overnight. They surfaced gradually over the past century as urban and rural communities developed radio and TV stations both independently and in conjunction with national broadcast corporations. Each of the technological objects represented by color-coded balloons is embedded within a set of material conditions and local histories, within what Maxwell and Miller call a, quote, materialist ecology of media. In this sense, this Google Earth FCC info interface can be thought of as activating further inquiry, as it isolates and directs attention to a multitude of sites and objects that demand further critical, historical, and phenomenological investigation. Historically, such cartographic overviews of broadcast systems have been preserved for industry experts, whether corporate players, regulators, network administrators, or electrical engineers. The presentation of this information within publicly accessible digital platforms is a relatively recent practice that presents opportunities to think about and research broadcast technologies in different ways. While most media scholars and consumers are familiar with radio and TV receivers, computers, and mobile phones, fewer are familiar with the network infrastructures and localized sites that are built and used to transmit signals to such devices. What would it mean to shift critical focus away from the fetishized objects of consumer electronics and toward the transmission facilities that turn vast swaths of the Earth's surface into signal territories? In the longer version of this article, I draw upon Earth-observing media, including historical network maps, and actually a link to the previous talk. I look at maps of railway, telegraphy, and early radio as kind of precursors to some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I also look at Google Earth interfaces as well as conduct field work and do site visits. And the goal of this work is to, number one, draw attention to infrastructures as important sites for historical and critical analysis in media studies. Two, to explore multiple approaches for thinking about infrastructural intelligibility, ranging from cartography to phenomenology, from circuit diagrams to photography. Three, to foreground the biotechnical aspects and resource requirements of broadcast infrastructure. And four, to offer a creative mediation of an infrastructure site. I used the Google Earth FCC info interface to imagine the practice of broadcasting as something that cannot be readily reduced to sites of the screen, the studio, or the home, but that is happening in vertical space all the time, as something that is environmental. Put another way, I use this interface to expand the kinds of sites, objects, and processes that media studies research tends to focus on. And following Lee Starr, call for further exploration of what she calls the boring stuff of infrastructure. When Google Earth first emerged in 2005, geographers suggested that the virtual globe had the potential to catalyze greater public involvement in mapping, and celebrated it as bolstering practices of participatory or volunteer geography that had begun with GIS. At the same time, however, since Google Earth relies on an international user community to produce content known as layers, georeferenced data sets accompanied by graphics and icons that are formatted as KMZ files that can be viewed in the platform, it draws upon the free labor of internet users, the uncompensated expenditures of human energy, time, attention, which Tiziana Terranova argues have become a defining condition of network culture. While some critics have evaluated Google Earth's participatory structures, others have critiqued the platform's relation to national sovereignty, highlighting opposition of countries from Australia to India, from Morocco to South Korea, to Google's release of high-resolution geospatial imagery of their sovereign territories, including sites deemed critical to national security. Still, others have positioned Google Earth as part of a long lineage of global representation, whether as emblematic of an Apollonian eye in the sky or as part of a neo-Baroque aesthetic. Rather than approach Google Earth in broad brushstrokes, I focus here on one layer, FCC info. And using a series of screen captures, I explore how this layer structures and communicates information about the U.S. broadcast system, and whether it has the potential to extend technological literacies and materialist understandings of distribution practices beyond a community of experts. FCC Info was created by the private consulting firm Cavell, Metz & Associates and made available as a free download in 2009. Based in Manassas, Virginia, the firm's mission is, quote, to make complex technical and related regulatory issues understandable and manageable. And the company took on this project to promote its mapping and consulting services. The FCC layer, info layer generates an interactive cartographic display of all registered and licensed radio and TV stations, antennas, tower, and microwave broadcast facilities in the United States. I'm showing you some screen captures here of Chicago, just quickly. AM radio stations are represented in purple, FM in green, TV stations in red, and registered towers in orange. You see a lot of the orange in the macro view. Microwave links are represented in light blue. Here's a closer, you can zoom in, but then you can get really close, and you can't see it very well here, but you'll see this color coding if you look at the layer, and you can see that you see microwave links in light blue, lavender, and pink. The layer also provides pop-up windows offering detailed information about each structure and site, including the type of structure, its height, above ground level and sea level, the channel, and the owner of the structure. Through the pop-up window, the user can click on a hyperlink to an FCC website with even more data about the particular structure and site and its licensing history. So you can go from there. I'm sorry you can't see this so well, but you can really get on top of buildings and actually see the physical forms quite well. So the user can also zoom in on specific network nodes or facilities and acquire aerial and, in some cases, street view perspectives of broadcast infrastructure sites. Never before had U.S. citizens, or the international community for that matter, had such comprehensive and immediate access to information about U.S. broadcast infrastructure in both well-known urban media hubs and smaller, more remote and more rural media markets. To explore this layer in greater detail, I discuss a series of screenshots of broadcast infrastructure sites in my hometown media market of Santa Barbara, California. Using Google Earth's navigation features, I zoomed from a national perspective to a local overview of this relatively small media market of 80,000 people on the central coast of California, sandwiched between the denser signal territories of Los Angeles to the south and San Francisco to the north. Santa Barbara has two main transmission facilities located on the mountains above the city, which are in or adjacent to the Los Padres National Forest. One is located to the northeast and one to the southeast. Both of these facilities transmit signals to radio and TV stations in Santa Barbara and to other nearby towns such as Solvang, Santa Ynez, and Ventura via microwave links. By zooming in on one of these facilities, it's possible to obtain a more detailed understanding of the signal traffic in this market as icons draw attention to different structures and transmissions. For instance, a close analysis of the facility on Gibraltar Road reveals there are 20 FM radio transmissions, 12 TV, 8 microwave, and 3 registered tower. Clicking on any of the balloons hyperlinks the user to the FCC website, where there's further data about the licensee and the structure that's been licensed and can be found. By isolating different broadcast systems, facilities, sites, and processes, this layer compels a site-specific, object-oriented, and ecological approach to the study of broadcasting. If integrated within media studies courses, the layer could help students to conceptualize and research broadcasting not only in relation to what appears in the frame or through the speaker, but also as property claims, transmission processes, spectrum and resource allocations, maintenance labor, and signal traffic. Approaching a location as a signal territory requires an investigation of the multiple signals being transmitted through the air in a location at any given moment, the technological and natural resources that are required to do so, and the spatio-temporal dimensions of transmission. Signal territories exist across urban and rural, wealthy and poor, local and national, terrestrial and circumterrestrial domains. They are fields shaped by human and non-human actors, perceptible and imperceptible activities. Signal territories cannot be seen with the naked eye. Rather, they must be produced discursively or through phenomenological engagements. In general, their presence must be inferred rather than observed. Inspired by the FCC Google interface, I set out to develop what Kimber and Zelinska call a creative mediation, a form of media analysis that is, quote, simultaneously critical and creative, and that, quote, seeks to promote the invention of different forms of engagement with media, end quote. In their book, Life After New Media, Kimber and Zelinska challenge conventional forms of media analysis and call for, quote, a more dynamic, networked, and engaged mode of working on and with the media, in which critique is always already accompanied by the work of participation and invention, end quote. Rather than approach media as static objects, Kimber and Zelinska urge us to reflect upon the vital processes of mediation, which we, as critics, are always already implicated within. They argue for envisaging, quote, envisaging and enacting playful, experimental, yet rigorous cross-disciplinary interventions and inventions that will be equally at home with critical theory and media practice, and that will be prepared to and able to make a difference academically, institutionally, politically, ethically, and aesthetically. That's an incredibly difficult charge to take on, but I'm inspired by this, their call nonetheless. So my creative mediation begins with this printed screenshot of Google Earth FCC info interface, which I used to guide my drive into the hills above Santa Barbara along the curvy Gibraltar Road to the turnoff of a local transmission facility. There I found an open gate with a sign, "No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." If I drove down the road, I would apparently be breaking the law, which was ironic given that the site is owned by an organization called Community Radio, Inc. Since the site was open and since I'm inspired by the work of place hackers like Bradley Garrett, I drove a half-mile down the very narrow, recently paved road and parked my car so I could walk up the rest of the driveway to the facility. As I walked up the final stretch of the road, I encountered a series of signs and on the fence warning, radio frequency fields beyond this point may exceed the FCC general public exposure limit. Another sign indicated caution, high-level radio frequency energy area, no trespassing in English and Spanish. I continued to the end of the road and discovered a second gate, this one closed and locked, with posted information about the site administrator and more warning signs. I also found a wooden box next to the fence with a white notebook inside used by site workers to sign in and out during their visits. The sheet was empty. Since I could not get in the main lock gate, I started to return to my car. As I was walking, I noticed a side fence had been left open and decided to venture inside to get a closer glimpse of the medley of towers, antenna, and dishes on the site. They appeared in different shapes and sizes and were painted matte gray or white or were aluminum so that they camouflaged in with the area and were difficult to see from a distance, calling forth the complex plays of visibility and invisibility that Hannah Rose Shell explores in her book on camouflage, Hide and Seek. A rickety wood scaffolding supported some of the antennas, suggesting the site's elevation was not high enough for some transmission needs. I also noticed jumbled debris and unused material strewn about the site, including piping, bricks, and metal parts. While walking around the site, I acquired a much more proximate physical sense of the site. I could hear the buzz of electrical equipment, feel the burning heat of the mid-afternoon sun baking the pavement, and smell the scent of warm chaparral bush mixed with ocean air, and see massive power lines stretching across the hillsides and 3 large transmission towers further up the mountain. While approaching the facility, I was not sure whether I was on private or public land, what the penalties for trespassing would be, and whether there were serious health hazards linked to being so close to transmission sites. My wandering of the site led me to think about broadcast infrastructure very differently than when I viewed it in Google Earth. This is probably not surprising, but thinking through it was helpful for me. Rather than a massive system that could be seen from above, infrastructure became something that could be sensed, felt, and mediated by my own body. Mapping the signal territory in this more effective and physical way required recognizing that the site, which looked quite orderly in Google Earth, was actually quite eclectic and messy on the ground. a scattered archaeology of transmission equipment that was more akin to high-tech ramshackle or 21st century hillbilly. The visit also challenged me to think about the biotechnical dimensions of broadcasting. This infrastructure site is not only made of metals, plastics, rubber, and electromagnetic fields, but also of soil, rock, vegetation, insects, lizards, birds, and animals, organic materials and life forms that cannot be perceived in Google Earth and are not typically thought of as part of a media ecology. As my fieldwork around the site tuned me into the biotechnical dimensions of this tiny sliver of U.S. broadcast infrastructure, it enabled me to think about issues that I would never have considered by examining the site only in Google Earth. Some physical aspects of the site were completely missing in Google Earth. The series of gates and trespassing signs I encountered in geophysical space, for instance, contrasted with smooth and unfettered access to the site in digital space. The pieces of hardware represented by color-coded balloons in Google Earth were camouflaged at the site so that they blended in with the local environs, and since they were fenced off, were more difficult to see and identify. High voltage currents and electrical radiation were announced as human health hazards at the site, yet were apparently safe for other wildlife in the vicinity, but were absent in Google Earth. The contingency of this facility's operation on other infrastructures, such as the electrical grid, fixed telephony lines, the water and sewer systems, was not evident in Google Earth, but became clear during the site visit. And finally, the sound of broadcast infrastructure, the persistent ambient buzz of electrical activity, which provides an acoustic sense that something dynamic is happening, is altogether missing at the Google Earth interface. Most of all, the site led me to think about the importance of fieldwork as a vital method for investigating media technologies. In an era in which the world can be navigated in Google Earth and seen in Street View, accessed through Google's search engines and streamed from YouTube's archives, media researchers seem to spend more time than ever at screen interfaces and less time venturing out in the field, wherever it may be. It's worth thinking carefully about how our critical practices and methods are shaped and informed not only by our social subjectivities, technological literacies, and intellectual training, but also by the geophysical positions we are willing to engage with, occupy, or explore. How often do we move beyond what Mark Andreevich has called the digital enclosure, or what Nick Coldry calls the media center? If we're willing to take seriously the fusion of the biological and the technological, it's important to consider not only how consumer electronics become human prostheses, but also how automated facilities on the outskirts of cities that are dug deep into the dirt and surrounded by plants and wildlife, seemingly in the middle of nowhere, are integral to broadcasting in the digital age. In this sense, my project is invested in exploring what Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost referred to as new materialisms, which, as they explain, bring biopolitics, critical geopolitics, and political economy together with genealogies and phenomenologies of everyday life. By thinking and moving between Google Earth and a specific infrastructure site, I began to recognize and investigate the ways in which resources such as lands, water, electricity, heavy metals, and other materials are organized to transmit signals and in the process turn vast swaths of the Earth's surface into signal territories. As Maxwell and Miller insist, quote, understanding media requires studying them up, down, and sideways, end quote. And I hope to continue doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was great. Okay, and I'm going to now introduce our final speaker, who's Patty Scannell, who was professor at the University of Michigan. But before moving to Michigan, Patty worked for many years here in London at the University of Westminster. I think it had a different title, and I'm forgetting what it was specifically in the past. Where in 1975, he helped to establish the UK's first undergraduate media studies degree. He's perhaps best known as a historian of broadcasting, and his work has focused in particular on the phenomenology of talk as the everyday communicative medium of radio and television. Scannell is a founding editor of the journal Media, Culture, and Society, and his books include Radio, Television, and Modern Life, as well as Media and Communication. And Patty is going to speak today to us. The title of his talk is To the Things Themselves, Thoughts on the Phenomenology of Media. Patty.
Well, hello everyone, and I want to start by saying how thrilled I am that we're here talking about phenomenology. I must say, I sort of feel as though I'm sort of coming out. It's the first time that I have appeared in public, sort of publicly wearing a badge saying phenomenology. And I'm very much looking forward to this day because it's my first experience of people working in our field getting together under the sort of the broad umbrella of something that I hope may be progressively clarified as the day goes on, namely what we think phenomenology is, or perhaps better, what, as Don Idy would put it, what doing phenomenology entails. I was a phenomenologist sort of avant la lettre. In other words, it took me a long time to discover that in fact is what I was and what I am and what I've always been doing. I've always been interested in the study of media and communication as they are embedded in the contexts of everyday life. I've always thought of them as aspects of everyday life, and I've always been interested in how we encounter the communicative situation, particularly in respect of our engagements with radio and television. I started off, therefore, with the sociology of everyday life, Irving Goffman, Harold Garfinkel, and Harvey Sachs, and I now think of this as a phenomenological sociology. From there, I sort of segued into the question of broadcast talk, as Scott has said, and with the pragmatics of talk, starting, that is to say, with ordinary language philosophy, with Austin and H.P. Grice, and then the developing field of pragmatics. But it wasn't until the mid-1990s, I was in my mid-50s, that I read Heidegger that, so to speak, clarified my understanding of what is at stake in the notion of the everyday world of things. And Heidegger's analysis of the everyday world in Division 1 of Being and Time underpins everything that I'm saying, but I'm not going to, as it were, sort of flag up the footnotes. As a matter of fact, and here's a plug, I have a book coming out, Television and the Meaning of Live. It's coming out with Polity, it's in production, and it will be out by the end of the year. But I better stop flanneling and actually get to the thing itself, which is what I'm here to talk about. All right, so let me just first of all flag up my understanding of the phenomenological approach to things. Firstly, and clearly, I think it is pragmatic in its approach to its object of inquiry. It asks, how does it work? What can we do with it? And its crucial question is the usability and the workability of words and language and of things and world. It is concerned with the practices of use and their situational constraints. It is oriented to action rather than to theoretical contemplation. It assumes that things and their practices have an implicit logic of use And this logic of use is immanent in the things themselves, in the things, in the practices. These logics of use are the structural features that produce the things and the practices as reasonable, accountable, and thereby workable stroke usable. In this approach to things and their practices in their embedded everyday situations of use, this approach is oriented to the perspective of the ordinary and the mundane. That is to say, to the routine use of things in action. As such, it is oriented to the point of view of the laity, not to the point of view of the priest or the professor. It engages with how we, all of us, ordinarily, in everyday situations, engage with, encounter and engage and put to good use or otherwise our everyday things in their ordinary everyday availability. Finally, I find that the phenomenological approach shares the ordinary or the natural attitude to the world and its things. And that is an attitude of trust, of taking the world of appearances at face value, rather than the standard or default academic position, of course, which is the opposite. A hermeneutics of suspicion, which approaches things with a skeptical, suspicious, doubting attitude. So I'm going to try and very briefly unpack what is at stake in the trustworthiness of the everyday world and its things, and the ways in which they work to give that trust in them, that by and large and ordinarily and for the most part, it seems to me, constitutes our natural attitude towards them. So we have three key words: the everyday world of things. Let me briefly say something about each. First of all, by world, what I have in mind is what Heidegger endlessly sort of is referring to in Being and Time, namely the Umwelt. That is to say, means round or about. The Umwelt, therefore, is the immediate environment, the world in which I am situated, this world for us here and now, as we encounter it in everyday situations and circumstances. This world is a totally human world. Or to put it slightly differently, we live, privileged members of postmodern societies, in a totally technologized world. The technological infrastructure that Lisa sort of gave us such a rather wonderful vision of just now sort of underpins the conditions of everyday existence for all of us. The key term, however, is what we mean by and what our understanding is of the word everyday. What do we mean by an everyday world? What is an everyday thing? Now, obviously, an everyday world and an everyday thing means a world and its things that works every day. Not now and then, not occasionally, not when it's in the mood, but all day, every day, yesterday, tomorrow, and tomorrow. It works continuously and without interruption, and I take it that this is obvious to all of us, because it is what has provided the possibility of our actually being gathered here together at this moment. The question then arises, all right, so what are the consequences of a working, everyday, workable, workaday world and its things? It has, of course, an entirely routine and taken for granted character. And we are able to take it for granted. We are able, as it were, to regard it and treat it as obvious, natural, given, and therefore, in a sense, boring and uninteresting, precisely because it works for us routinely and fundamentally, and this is my big idea, I think, or one of them. The crucial thing we have to understand is that we don't see this, and the question is why. We only have to worry about things when they go wrong, as of course they do from time to time. Now, it should be obvious that what I'm talking about, the world and its things, is characterized by an absolutely unfathomable complexity. A complexity that none of us could ever unravel. You could take anything, any bit of technology, and if you try to unravel it all the way back, that is to say, all the things that separately and together come together to constitute it as the thing as we encounter it, you would never get there. And yet, of course, it is this unfathomable complexity that we never, ever notice. It is, that is to say, invisible and concealed from us, except when Lisa shows it to us in action. But we don't normally see Google Earth, nor do we see the transmitters, the technologies that deliver the radio and television. That is part of our everyday lives. In other words, the world and all its things simultaneously reveals and conceals itself in a double movement. It is always there in plain sight. It's there for all to see, and yet, in some crucial ways, we never see it. And it's this problematic that I want to unravel a little bit. And I want to give it a positive interpretation. You see, in the field that I work in, the original approach to television was one which regarded the way in which television presents itself as natural, obvious, and so on and so forth. This was treated with deep suspicion. The master concept for media studies, and I was part of this development in the 1970s, was the concept of ideology. So what you were trying to do was to unmask the ways in which technology, for instance, the technology of television, the institutions of television, conceal their production practices. The argument being that this was because, by and large and on the whole, the output of television worked in favor of ruling interests, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we know all this. But what I want to defend is a contradictory, positive interpretation of precisely the problem of the invisibility of the practices, of what it is that is hidden in things. And secondly, I want to add in passing that, of course, not all things are everyday things. As examples of non-everyday things, well, we can take fMRI scanners, the Hadron Super Collider, or Google Earth. As a general rule, I'd put it like this. If we see the thing as technology, it is not an everyday thing. And if we see it as an everyday thing, that is to say, if we don't see it as technology, we are seeing it as part of our own everyday world and life. Now, we must assume that the enormous technological complexity of media technologies of communication is deliberately and intentionally concealed, and necessarily so, if a thing is to be an everyday thing. An everyday thing is something, anything, that anyone can use, not just some people, but anyone, anytime, anywhere. And what do we mean by use? What is a usable thing? an everyday full of use, an everyday useful, usable thing must present itself to us as such. That is to say, it must present itself as for use. This means two things. It means, firstly, that anyone can A, figure out what it's for, what to do with it, its what, and then secondly, and it is secondly, you can figure out how to use it. So the what and the how of anything is an immanent feature of the thing itself and the way in which it presents itself to us as a thing for use. What's this button for? What's this switch for? I'm rather glad that my longtime friend and colleague Sean Moores is coming after me, because he is going to precisely pick up and elaborate what we're doing with our fingers when we press switches and turn buttons. It is a fundamental phenomenological question. All right, so I have argued in Television, The Meaning of Life, which I mentioned before, that if we are to give a formal account of the usability of things, that everyday things have 6 indices of utility. That an everyday thing, for it to be an everyday thing, must have the following 6 characteristics. It must be affordable, it must be attractive, it must be usable, it must be reliable, it must be durable, and perhaps crucially and above all, it must be safe. Now, I have written at some length about this, and I will not elaborate on any of these points at this moment. Suffice it to say that, if you look into it, that each of these 6 indices of utility is individually necessary and indispensable. If you take any one away, then the thing is going to cease to be an everyday thing for use by anyone, anywhere, anytime. Together, these indices of utility constitute the technological care structure of the thing. What do I mean by care structure? It's a concept, of course, that comes out of Heidegger's analysis of care as the foundational condition of Dasein. But I've taken it and adapted it and reworked it to apply it not to human beings and their care and their care structures, but to the care structures of the everyday world, the built environment, and any and everything. So any and everything, any practice has its care structure, and the care structure is always and of necessity invisible. It is the relational totality of the hidden labor that has realized the thing as such, as an everyday, usefully usable thing by anyone, at any time, anywhere. The hermeneutic task, therefore, the task of interpreting the care structures, is twofold, and it operates at 2 levels. We start with the phenomena, with the world of appearances, with the visible things, with the ways in which things present themselves as things for use, in terms of their what and their how. And the second level of analysis, which follows from this, concerns how it is that things appear to us as that which they manifestly and in fact are. How the thing appears to us as the telephone, as the laptop, as the washing machine, and so on and so forth. The manifest as, then, things as they really are, as we encounter them, that is the first level. The second level inquiry, and this is a distinction again from Heidegger, the hermeneutic as concerns what constitutes the manifest as such. And it is what constitutes the manifest as such that is always hidden and invisible, and that is the care structure. The concept of the care structure is both explanatory and justificatory. It explains why, as it were, things, practices, etc., conceal themselves, and it justifies why they are so. Let me just give an example of two ways in which I apply this concept to the study of television. I'll be there. Television, in my study of television and its liveness, I look at two care structures. The technological care structure, the TV set as seen, and the production care structure, the television programs as watched. Let me say just one final thing about each. The logic of use, all right, so the technological care structure of the TV set, whatever we mean by that, what we're, I'm trying, what I'm, the technological care structure concerns the logic of use that is immanent in the thing as a bit of everyday equipment, the way in which it presents itself as available for use, and the ways in which it is, in fact, put to use. And I have a chapter called What Happens When I Turn on the Television Set, which goes into very tedious detail about precisely what is at stake in that little act of turning the darn thing on. What happens to me, what happens to the set, etc., etc. The production care structure. Again, it is obvious that by and large television programs conceal how they are made, and this is their natural effect. And what I'm interested in are the ways in which the hidden production process that produces for us the experience of, for instance, the liveness of television, the liveness of the soccer match, the tennis match, the wedding, the catastrophe, live and in real time, and as it happens. And the invisible production care structure works so that our experience of watching television is not, so to speak, intruded upon by the process of production. The process of production conceals itself in order to produce for us the effect of a direct encounter and an engagement with what is going on in the world. And this question of accounting for the invisible production practices is prior to any normative judgment that we might wish to make about their content. And I think I've done my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham, Lisa, and Patty, for really interesting opening remarks. I think they've introduced a lot of themes, and a lot of themes in common. Now, the way this will work is I'd like to initially invite the keynotes, if you'd like, to add comments or ask questions of one another, to which you may respond. We'll keep it relatively brief so that we also then have time to open up opportunity for questions from the floor. And again, I just remind people who are asking from the floor that when you ask a question, please state your name and affiliation so that we know who you are, and also because it's being filmed, so anyone else who's watching this knows who you are. So, beginning with all of you, would any of you like to ask something, add something, make a comment?
Let me first ask the practical question of Lisa. There were some gaps on the map, that FCC map. Some of them were obviously Appalachia, but what were the other gaps? Why were there some areas, often unexpected, that had no communications towers or anything?
Yeah, we would, maybe I should put it back up there and we can look at it, because there might be different explanations for different gaps. So I can do that if you want to get, sorry. Are you talking about the very first slide?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And the data is just from the United States. you can, let's see, I'll go back to the top.
Here, obviously, I can imagine this is Appalachia. But up in here, Pennsylvania, I was surprised by this relatively empty area.
Yeah, the other thing is when you zoom in, it's really hard for them to compress all of this data into a single frame. And I contacted them and asked them to do this, and they said that it was almost impossible and crashed the system to put all of the data into one frame. So I think some of this, like as you zoom in, the congestion gets incredibly elaborate. And the counterpoint to this is a Google Earth layer of satellites in orbit. So there's a whole layer that was generated, so you can see like, I mean, it almost crashes the system because it's so much data. But in some areas where there's desert, mountainous regions, smaller populations, obviously there aren't as much broadcast facilities. So it has to do with topography, population density.
Okay. And I also had a question for Patty, which is one of your criteria for everyday objects was affordability. I can understand why something would have to be affordable to be everyday in the sense of accessibility, but a lot of your concept of the everyday had to do with hiddenness. Aren't there things that are hidden that are not affordable at all, almost such as this kind of infrastructure?
Oh yes, and that's absolutely right. When I was thinking of in terms of affordability and attractiveness, it's what's at stake in buying, for instance, an iPhone. The attractiveness is clearly an important part of it. And affordability, I mean, it has sort of fuzzy boundaries. But the notion of mass production sort of entails a sort of a mode of production that produces things, for mass purchase that are within the range of the pockets of the majority of people, rather than sort of an exclusive thing. All everyday things have an inclusive, every aspect of them is an inclusive characteristic.
Right, so expensive items, by their very nature, would be obtrusive.
Yes, that's right. Yes, of course they would. Of course, we all go lusting after them. I live near Bicester Village, which has become an attraction for the whole of Europe.
Anyone else want to?
Well, I apologize for having missed Graham's, but I was very fascinated by the, so to speak, the overview and the ground level view of the infrastructure. Could you say a bit more about your understanding of infrastructure in relation to and what its role is in our understanding of, in quotes, media and communication?
I didn't actually use the term infrastructure today. I've used it at other times as a piece of counter-terminology against system. Philosophy is supposed to be systematic, which means you're supposed to explain everything.
Sure.
I think of philosophy as more like an infrastructure, that you start by connecting points where you have interesting ideas. Because if you start trying to have an opinion about everything in philosophy, you're going to end up with 80% banalities. And so it's better to start with the things where you do have surprising ideas and then start expanding it outward, kind of like you would with a rail network. What I was talking about today, though I didn't use the term infrastructure, I was talking about the backgrounds. I was talking about Heidegger and McLuhan. And what I was trying to say is that both of them are thinkers of depth. They're both people who think that any surface content is completely superficial and useless, and you have to look deeper and deeper all the time. Yet paradoxically, you end up with a situation in which nothing could ever happen if that were the case. If everything was so deep, it could never make any contact with anything else. And so for both Heidegger and McLuhan, you have this paradoxical case where everything happens on the surface, despite their wish to have it otherwise. So that was, in a nutshell, what I was talking about. And I pointed out that, in a sense, mediation has two senses. There's McLuhan's sense where it's the background, where it's the medium is the message, it's that which is not the content. At the same time, the mediation is also that which allows communication, not that which hides in the background, but that which stands in the foreground, linking two different things. Yeah. And I think both of those senses of mediation are very important for philosophy right now.
Did you want to answer anything, Lisa, around infrastructure or?
Yeah, for me, I'm really trying to think of it in very physical terms, and the word gets used a lot in many different ways. But as a media scholar, I'm really trying to draw attention to those physical sites that have so much to do with the trafficking of world signal transmission, and to think about them as dynamic sites of operation that should be historicized, and we should be able to have critical models for studying those processes, just like we've developed elaborate ways of understanding narrative structure and textuality and audience responses. I feel that it's also important to think about these dynamic, environmentally situated processes that are important. And so in some ways I have a reductive definition of infrastructure, because I'm thinking of them as sites. And I couldn't, when I got in the hotel room last night, I just stared out the window at all the satellite dishes next door, and at the transmission towers. I'm obsessed with those kinds of things much more than, but I appreciate the point you were making, Bill, bringing Heidegger and McLuhan together and thinking about, the deep background is everything. And that's something that that resonates a lot with the way that I've been thinking about these infrastructure sites. But
it strikes me how vulnerable these sites are, despite all the warning signs.
Absolutely.
Have there been efforts to sabotage these sites? Is it only a matter of time before terrorists or eco-protesters decide to start going after these physical locations?
Some of them are much more significant than others in terms of level of security. One of my graduate students, well, she's a former graduate student, Nicole Staroselsky, who's giving a talk at ICA. She's done field work looking at transoceanic cable landing sites, and those are, highly secured, and there are military protocols around those in different places around the world, because that's where all the internet signal traffic moves around the world. Satellite earth stations are also really highly secured, but a little broadcast facility like this, even though it has fences and warning signs, it's pretty easy to penetrate and investigate. And I feel like I'm only at the beginning of developing a kind of critical language and a kind of mode of sensuous engagement for thinking about these things, and all of the operations that are kind of implicit within them.
We've lost internet a couple of times in Egypt during my time there, supposedly because somebody dropped an anchor on the Mediterranean cable. So we had no internet at all for...
Well, I've done some field work in Mongolia, doing research on mobile telephony usage in Ulaanbaatar. And one of the things that happens in Mongolia is that there's such a, the economy is such that people want to salvage the copper that's used in the cables that stitch the country into the internet system. So they'll hack out like a quarter mile of it, put it in trucks, and sort of hide it, and then salvage the metals. And this happens not only in Mongolia, but other parts of the world too, and creates huge disruptions, which also leads me to comment on Patty's comment about that you really emphasize the workability of things. And I know you're playing with this word, but there are so many times where things don't work, or, so I'm just wondering, not only does failure teach us about technology and its operations, but there's so many things to investigate around that. I'm really looking forward to hearing Sean Moore's talk later about hands. I've been working a little bit with people in Zambia too, and people don't know what a mouse is. They don't know how to type on a keyboard. But computing and mobile phone equipment is being dumped into remote villages and in cargo containers. It just sits there because people don't have the physical, not just the verbal and written literacy, but the physical literacy as to how to use a keyboard and a computer. So these are kinds of interesting things. The workability of issues, I think, is important to think about.
Yeah, okay. So we'll open it up then to the audience, and Halvard here will be coming with a microphone, so if you could wait until he arrives. There's somebody here with his hand up near the back, Halvard. And please, as a reminder, do state your name and affiliation.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all three speakers for this wonderful opening of this day. I have a question. My name is Günther Thomas. I'm from a philosophy and religious studies angle. I have a two questions. One to Patty. The everyday world is without stitches, it's uninterrupted, it's a seamless stream. But if you emphasize the trust in the technology and the affordability and so on, my mother lives in a different world than my daughter. So how do you account for the tension in the phenomenology that we have the seamless stream and accessibility, invisibility, and so on, but we have the particularity of the evidence, and that is falling apart today.
What's falling apart?
The particularity of the evidence. So my daughter with a smartphone and my mother with a dial phone.
Yeah.
So according to your approach, they live in different worlds. But then you have the tension, how do you balance the seamless stream of everyday world and the different world? And the second, I think the second question concerns the distinction between presentation and a presentation that was running through all three proposals. Patty was saying we need a presentation of the technology in order to have it work and have the trust. But Lisa was saying that's fascinating what is not present. Why do people should be interested in the transmission sequence? Normally people don't care where the priest is buying the wine for the Eucharist. So in all systems we have the presentation in order to have it work. So Patty would say, well, you're working on something that people should not know, or that they don't want to know. But you had the fascination with the expedition up to the mountain. You wanted to know it. Was it just scholarly interest?
Are there any other questions? I'd like to collect a few if there are some others. Margaret, right? Yes. Albert.
Hi, Margaret Schwartz, Fordham University, Communication Media Studies. This is actually a question for Lisa, and I'm interested in embodiment, and so I was fascinated by this sort of on-site exploration, and I wondered if you could say more about, you talk about encountering these different danger signs, and you talk about the notebook where the workers are signing in and out. I was just, what I thought about was, well, and one of them's bilingual, right? So there's some assumption that the people speaking Spanish, which is a local assumption, right? Might need to know that information. But what sorts, I just maybe wonder if you could speak more about what sorts of bodies are in some ways interpolated by that site, right? So that the danger to your body, if you were a pregnant woman versus, I don't know, someone with a pacemaker or something, right? Like what kind of physical danger are they warning you about? Is it danger to your ears? What kinds of bodies are more or less in danger here? And then also the laboring bodies on that site are presumably also subject to those dangers, but how are those dangers managed, or how are those bodies understood differently as being permeable, or the site is permeable to them in a way that it isn't to other people? So I just thought that there were certain kinds of bodies that the site also seemed to suggest, and I'm sure you have thoughts about that, and I'd love to hear.
I'll take one more question from Brent, who's right here.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Brent Mullen from the University of Pittsburgh Communication Studies, and I have a question. I enjoyed all the papers. I have a question for Graham, and it's about McLuhan and the kind of the surface depth that you're talking about. And it seems like you're drawing a parallel between his medium and message and surface and depth. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more about that, because I wondered. One of the last examples you gave was about how email, that the changes or the situation you're doing is about interaction. You said that's really about surface. And so is that, and then you sort of drew a parallel between that and content. And it seems to me that McLuhan's very interested in that, and that for him would be an element of the medium. And so I wonder if you could just kind of talk about the relationship between those things, if those are distinctions you're making or distinctions that you see McLuhan making.
Okay, so if you'd like to offer some responses to these first three sets.
I'll go first then. McLuhan, of course, systematized all of his work in this later concept of the tetrad, where you've got enhancement and obsolescence, which is pretty much the same thing as Heidegger's background and foreground. Then the interesting ones are retrieval and reversal. Retrieval and reversal are how media change for later McLuhan. And both of those occur because of triggers at the surface. That's the fascinating thing. A medium overheats, not because it was already too hot, but because too many of that kind of media appear and you have an overload. You have too many cars appear, and so suddenly a car is not convenient, and it reverses into a hassle with traffic jams and insurance payments and so forth. So it's at the accidental level of the accidental properties of cars or computers or any other medium that make it overheat, that make it too cluttered, that cause us to reverse into the next medium. That's one way. The other way is the retrieval, which he says is what artists do, which is where they take cliches and bring them back to life. So again, that requires the conscious effort of an artist. He means artist in a very wide sense, to take a dead thing and bring it back to life, which is precisely why McLuhan is not a technological determinist. There's so many different ways that the medium can reverse into the next medium, that even if that medium is in the background dominating us, he's not a determinist, because the medium could change in any number of different ways. So the retrieval and the reversal, the two ways the media can change, both end up being triggered from the surface. And I drew a parallel with Heidegger, because even though Heidegger is this ultimate philosopher of the depth and the surface is merely superficial, you still need Dasein as the shepherd of Sein, and for reasons I've argued, you need any relation between entities has to occur at the surface. So paradoxically, they end up becoming philosophers of superficiality rather than of depth, because they need the surface for anything to happen in the world. The depth is pretty static.
Lisa or Patty, would you like?
I guess I'll start with the question about why do these things, who cares? Like, why do these things matter? My training, I'm interested in feminist critiques of science and technology, and so there's a politics of knowledge involved in thinking about how things work and who has access to information about which things work and why they work. So I'm interested in hierarchies of knowledge in relation to technology, and transmission is an area that often gets relegated to electronical engineering, and I think it's a space we can use to expand the way we think about media so that we have further engagement with other fields like environmental studies, resource management, geography, even real estate. It's a kind of gateway for opening up the field's engagement with other paradigms and ways of thinking. So there are two parts to my answer then. First, it's a feminist issue. I feel like I need to know, I'm curious about how and why things work and why I'm socialized not to know how they work. And the second is to think of these sites as spaces for engaging with other knowledge formations in different disciplines, for keeping media studies dynamic.
The Margaret's question.
Yeah, and then it's a great question that you ask. And it's a complicated answer. I did interview the people who administer the site, but I didn't interview workers, and I think it's a great project to do a whole study of workers' bodies in relation to transmission facilities or broadcasting more general. There's a whole mode of work called creative labor. Most of that research in media studies looks at production cultures. People who are camera operators, editors, sound people. But just as we have that work, it would be also really interesting to think about the whole history of labor in relation to transmission facilities. And I've recently done some work on electrical linemen, the people who crawl up and down the poles, because I see the electrical grid as the kind of necessary precondition for a media culture. And those are the workers that make sure that power continues so that we could have something called liveness in television. So it's a way of thinking about that.
Patty.
Gunther, where are you?
Oh, he's yeah.
Has he moved?
No, he's there. He's just chatting with someone else right now.
Oh, hey, Gunther. Hello. First of all, it's lovely to see you again, and B, I'm about to answer or try to answer your question. Okay. First of all, your mum and her old dial phone and your daughter and her well, this is understandable, is it not, in terms of how we are differentially, so to speak, stitched into the technological world we live in. And one of the great differentiating factors is, of course, alas, age. I, too, have to get my daughter to explain to me how to use my smartphone, how to enter contacts, and so on and so forth. But I think I do want to insist on the seamless workability of things and the world. I don't know how, I was trying to think of how best to put it. I don't know if this will work for you. But I mean, I am struck every time I do it by flying. You know, getting into an aeroplane and flying sort of is absolute lunacy, is it not? I mean, every time the engines rev up and the plane starts down the runway, I have this moment of panic and fear. Why am I here? And first of all, I want to, why would anybody do something so mind-bogglingly crazy as to go 5 miles up in the air, etc., 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 if we did not trust absolutely that it was safe to all practical intents and purposes to do this. And I think you have to have some sense of the unfathomable complexity of the care structure that delivers this as an everyday routine thing that all of us have done in order to get here. Whenever I go through a large airport, like Detroit back home or Terminal 5 when I arrive here, again I am struck by the extraordinary complexity of the invisible processes that get me off the plane, that get me into the baggage hall, that get me my baggage through, in, and out of the system. Now, of course, we've all had infuriating moments when our bags have got lost, and it seems as though the people delivering our bags have, sort of taken half the day off or something of that sort. But this is what I mean by A, the workability of the world, and B, the fact that, and I do say it is a fact, that ordinarily all of us take it on trust. And this trust is not unwarranted. It is a pragmatic effect of the reliability of the workability of things and of the world.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time, and I'm conscious that we didn't quite deliver on the coffee, unfortunately. We were let down a little bit on that, but we do have coffee now, and so given that we do have coffee now, and it is 10:10 now, I suggest that we go break for coffee.
For those of you who don't know, I'm Tim Markham. I'm the other convener of this conference. And I just wanted to add my own personal welcome to Birkbeck and to this event. I think it's genuinely really exciting to have this particular constellation of individuals here in this place at this time. I thought the first panel really kicked things off brilliantly, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you, to hearing a lot of your papers later on, but also speaking to you individually as the day progresses. But for now, my job is to introduce our second panel of keynote speakers. And I'd like to begin by introducing Sean Moores. Now, Sean is Professor of Media and Communications at the University of Sunderland, and his research focuses on everyday media use and has become increasingly focused on engaging critically with the phenomenological approach or approaches to philosophy, anthropology, geography, and sociology. Sean is author of 5 books, including Media and Everyday Life in Modern Society, Media Theory, and Media, Place and Mobility, which I have my own students reading next week, in fact. And Sean is going to be presenting a paper for us right now, entitled Digital Orientations, Reconceptualizing Everyday Media Use, beginning with movements of the hands and fingers. Thank you.
Okay, I'll begin with a description of one of the things that I do routinely most mornings. I'll start again. I'm going to start with a description of one of the things that I do routinely most mornings. Opening my laptop computer to check my email inbox. So gently applying pressure to the base of the machine with the thumb of my right hand, my left hand thumb lifts the lid. My right hand index finger then slides from right to left across the touchpad, moving the cursor until it's located over an area in the center of the screen marked locked. Here I tap the left side of the touchpad to reveal my desktop display or the document that I was last working on. The same finger then slides downwards on the touchpad until the cursor lies over the internet search symbol that appears on the bar across the bottom of my screen, before tapping again to open my search page. Now, typically with 3 of the fingers of my right hand, I type in an abbreviated web address for my university's email system. Pressing 8 keys is usually enough for the link to appear. Moving the cursor upwards, I tap when it gets to that link, bringing up another one that reads login to staff email. Without having to move the cursor at this stage, since the link appears in the same position on the screen as that on the previous page, I tap a further time on the touchpad to bring up the page on which I'm required to give my username and password. These are then typed in at the appropriate on-screen locations. At one point, with a rapid sliding and tapping of the right-hand index finger to shift between these locations, and at another, with my right-hand thumb pressing caps lock before returning to cancel that command a moment later. After the smallest finger of my right hand then presses the enter key, I'm into my inbox. I should add there that I'd make no claims for this being the most efficient way of accessing my email. It's simply a description of what I ordinarily do. Now, although that opening description was basic, writing it proved difficult. I had to keep stopping to go online and access my email, because without actually performing the ordered, unfolding series of actions repeatedly, noting carefully the movement of my hands as I went along, I wouldn't have been able to write those words. This is because the practices involved are usually performed in an unreflective, taken-for-granted manner, at least without much conscious thought being given to the practices themselves. And yet I may be thinking about something else, such as an email message that I need to send, or the document that I'll continue working on after checking my inbox. The knowledge that I have of my laptop in use, of my position in relation to the touchpad and keys, and of how to find ways about there, but also of the cursor's movements on the screen and of the way to go to my inbox, is an embodied and sensuous knowledge. My dealings with the computer have a visual dimension, but my looking and more generally my practical knowing are inextricably caught up with the movements of my fingers or digits, and with their familiar feel, their being at home on the machine. To borrow David Sudnow's words from a different context, and I'll be discussing his work shortly, what have developed over time are particular ways of the hand. And in my paper, I'll explore further such mobile generative ways. This will lead me to ask if it might be possible to reconceptualize everyday media use by centering a concern with movement and dwelling, or at homeness. But in order to set up a framework within which I can pose that question of reconceptualization, it's going to be necessary for me to take what may seem like detours into the disciplines of philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. I'll be considering 3 main examples of manual activity that are not obviously media related. My first example comes from Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, and it features the practice of typing. Remember that he was writing back in the mid-20th century, when the typewriter wasn't the outmoded technology that it is today. According to Merleau-Ponty, routine typewriter users cultivated, over time in their relations with the banks of keys, a knowledge bred of familiarity, which, he said, is forthcoming only when bodily effort is made. If you take these users or their present-day counterparts who press on computer keyboards away from their machines, they'd struggle to describe, I think, the layout of the keys that they've come to know so well in practice. They've come to know through the movement and touch of their fingers. And in those circumstances, perhaps only the activity of air typing would enable users to get anywhere close to an accurate description of the keyboard layout. So Merleau-Ponty refers to their practical knowing as knowledge in the hands, and he argues that it's part of a broader bodily knowledge. His more general assertion is that it's the body which understands in the acquisition of habit, the body which catches and comprehends movement. He's well aware that for many of his readers, this argument will appear absurd, and yet he insists that the phenomenon of habit is just what prompts us to revise our notion of understand and our notion of the body. Okay, my second example of manual activity comes from the work of a philosophically inspired sociologist. This guy, David Sudnow, who I mentioned a moment ago. And I'm referring here to his book, Ways of the Hand, in which he gives a number of descriptions of his own practices of learning to play jazz on the piano. So, near to the start of Sudnow's story about the development of his jazz-making ways of the hand, he says that anyone who's witnessed or been a beginning pianist learning chords notices substantial initial awkwardness. This awkwardness is evident in the novice player's laboured searching and looking, groping to put each finger in a good spot, trying to get a hold on chords properly, to get from one to the next, playing progressions smoothly. Writing of his early experiences of learning to play chords and chord progressions on the piano, Sudnow recalls how, over the course of several months' practice, he says looking's workload progressively lightens. The gaze at the keyboard progressively diffuses in function. He says, as I reached for chords, for recurring patterns of them, I was developing an embodied way of accomplishing distance. And indeed, after several years of playing the instrument, Sudnow confidently states that with eyes closed, I may now sit down at the piano, gain an initial orientation with the merest touch, and then reach out to bring my finger precisely into a spot 2 feet off to the left. So Sudnow's body had got the measure of the instrument. And the keyboard space, or the directions and dimensions of his dealings with the piano, came to be gradually incorporated over time. A major difficulty faced by Sudnow, though, in learning to play jazz, had to do with acquiring skills of improvisation. He recalls being puzzled on occasion by the interweaving intricacies of his piano teacher's hand movements on the keyboard. Sudnow says, I'd ask, what was that? He'd ask, what was what? He'd have a hard time finding what he'd just done. He'd at times remark, "I can't tell you how. You'll have to develop a feel for it." And I guess what this shows is that it can be difficult to translate habitually performed embodied practices into words. Yet Sudnow makes the remarkable assertion that there's much in common between ordinary speaking and musical improvisation. And he regards the study of piano playing as a potential preface for the phenomenological description of talk. Now, developing a feel for improvisation was for Sudnow a long and often frustrating process of figuring out new ways to go with his fingers in the unfolding practice of playing. Still, he reports that after a while, there began to emerge up a little, down a little ways, rocking ways and every other finger ways, skipping ways, hopping ways, rippling ways, and more. His hands were increasingly becoming wayfully oriented, until eventually, as he puts it, the hand knew its ways. Sudnow had reached a stage at which, in his words, "I don't think at all about where I'm going. My hands make it up as they go along." Now, Sudnow characterizes jazz piano improvisation as an extraordinary domain of action. And yet, no doubt with an eye to Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, he goes on to draw a parallel between piano playing and the practice of typing, also finding typing to be a remarkably skilled accomplishment. Just as the beginning pianist experiences substantial initial awkwardness, so it's the case that the beginning typist may find himself spelling every word as he types, thinking of the spellings as a step-by-step search, looking for correct places. But in the case of the experienced typist, and by extension the experienced computer keyboard user, the hands behave spellingly. Once again, in Sudnow's terms, looking's workload has lightened, and the fingers have learned to accomplish distance, reaching for the correct keys without hesitation. They move at speed in the flow of practice, just as Sudnow's hands came to behave jazzfully on the piano. Equally, whilst I'd accept that jazz piano improvisation is a rare skill acquired over a lengthy period, I can see no reason why other parallels shouldn't be drawn between piano playing or typing and various contemporary uses of technology, including certain types of media use that are now widely regarded as ordinary domains of action. So with reference to, say, the remarkable dexterities of text messaging, I'd want to argue that the rapidly moving, knowledgeable thumbs of the experienced text sender have also come to behave spellingly, even if the spellings on mobile phone screens aren't always those found in a dictionary. Now, overall, Sudnow's book is of interest to me, not only because it offers a detailed account of the formation of embodied, sensuous, in-the-hands knowledge, but also because in doing so, it manages to point to crucial matters of movement and dwelling, or of orientation and habitation, which are of broader significance, I think, for studies of everyday life. Throughout his book, Sudnow writes about the acquisition of the habit of piano playing in terms of moving through and thereby inhabiting an environment or setting. He refers then to the finger's journey and to having gained handful command over myriad varieties of paths. And he ends his story by reflecting on how this jazz music is, first and foremost, particular ways of moving from place to place. Habitual movement, or routinely going along in a terrain nexus of hands and keyboard, is precisely what enabled him to come to feel at home in a setting of keys. And he writes explicitly of pianists' bodily relations to their keyboards as a dwelling. The keyboard space is inhabited as it gets incorporated. Okay, my third main example is drawn from the work of a philosophically inspired anthropologist, from Tim Ingold's recent book, Being Alive. And it's an account that Ingold gives of his own practices of sawing through a wooden plank while making a set of bookshelves. Ingold starts his account of plank sawing with a description that goes like this. He says, I placed the palm of my left hand on the plank, grasping it around the edge by the fingers. Taking up a saw with my right hand, I wrap my fingers around the handle. All that is except the index finger, which is extended along the flat of the handle, enabling me to fine-tune the direction of the blade. I position my head so that it's directly above the tool. From this angle, I can see the wood on either side of the cut. The first strokes are crucial, since the further the cut goes, the less room there is for maneuver. After a while, however, he says, I can relax my gaze and settle down to a rhythmic movement. Okay, now in Ingold's subsequent commentary, he makes an important point about what he calls bodily responsiveness. And he also seeks to relate studies of manual activity to issues of pedestrian movement and touch. So I'll say just a little now about those two things. Back at the beginning of my paper, when I was talking about my laptop use, I noted that routinely accessing my email is something I do in an unreflective, taken for granted manner, in the sense that little conscious thought is devoted to its doing. Yet unreflective practices of this sort mustn't be understood as automatic or as unresponsive in character. For Ingold, then, the skilled handling of tools is anything but automatic. It's rather rhythmically responsive to ever-changing environmental conditions. And crucially, he adds, that this responsiveness is not the awareness of a mind aloof from the hands-on business of work. It is rather immanent in practical, perceptual activity. And Ingold's interest is also in what he calls the processional quality of tool use. When sawing a plank, this involves moving through joined-up phases of getting ready, setting out, carrying on, and finishing off. And he chooses to equate the activities of sawing and walking, in which each step follows another and anticipates the next, in a continuous flowing processional order. Like going for a walk, says Ingold, sawing a plank has the character of a journey, and the experienced carpenter moves along paths, like the wayfarer who travels from place to place. Now, elsewhere in his writing, Ingold suggests that life itself has this processional quality, when he declares that every being is instantiated in the world as a path of movement along a way of life. This is Ingold's idea that life is lived along lines, and his assertion of the primacy of movement. In the words of philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, it might be said that Ingold, like Sudnow and Merleau-Ponty before him, is engaged in an investigation of how we come to find our way about in the world, which is also an investigation of how we make ourselves at home in the world. At the centre of Ingold's anthropological project are phenomenological questions about orientation and habitation. And the centering of these matters in his work can best be illustrated by his pivotal claim that inhabitants know as they go. This claim is one that Ingold first made in a book called The Perception of the Environment, where he insists that everyday skills of orientation, of knowing one's whereabouts and the way to go in a familiar setting, involve a serial, wayful understanding, what he later calls an alongly integrated knowledge, which can be contrasted with the upwardly integrated knowledge of a terrain that's produced by surveyors and cartographers. And by the way, Ingold is especially keen to dispute psychological accounts of orientation, which rely on the concept of a cognitive map. Okay, I'll move towards a conclusion. I think it's fair to say that media theorists and researchers don't usually spend time studying activities such as typing, piano playing, and plank sawing. And I think it's fair to say that movements of the hands and fingers or the feet aren't usually on the agenda in our academic field. My aim is to help in putting embodied practices and the senses more firmly on the agenda, but also to go a step further by asking if we can now productively begin our investigations of media use in everyday life by attending to mobile, generative ways of the hand that's at home with communication technologies. Following Ingold, we could then put practical, responsive engagements with environments right at the heart of our investigations, asserting the primacy of movement and the alongly integrated character of inhabitant knowledge, as well as insisting on the processional, ordered quality of media use. So the question towards which I've been building, my question of reconceptualization, is, might it be possible for us to reimagine the study of everyday media use by adopting what I'd want to call an orientation-habitation approach? Of course, the emergence of an orientation-habitation approach in media studies would necessarily be part of a larger project straddling several disciplines in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. It'd be a non-media-centric project because at its centre is a concern with movement and dwelling, or at-homeness, rather than any exclusive concern with media issues. But still, for those of us who are located in media studies, an important contribution that we can make to the wider interdisciplinary effort is to reflect on the particular characteristics and affordances of media. In my discussion so far, I've tended to place an emphasis on the things that everyday media use has in common with the routine uses of other objects or instruments. I've been focusing on the manual dexterities and more generally the bodily understandings involved in practices that range from checking an email inbox to sawing through a wooden plank. And yet, to take those two specific examples, the laptop computer and the handsaw, clearly have distinctive functions as work tools. I don't attempt to communicate with my colleagues or prepare a document with a saw, and cutting through wood with a computer is probably very difficult. Now, what helps to distinguish my laptop from Ingold's saw is what I'd call the doubly digital quality of contemporary media. So the laptop gives me access to numerous media settings that are continuously coming into being in my dealings with the machine. some of which I negotiate on a regular basis and experience as thoroughly familiar spaces of movement. My email inbox is just one of these familiar spaces, and I know my way around it. I inhabit it, just as my fingers find their way about and come to feel at home in a setting of touchpad and keys. And indeed, the crucial point I'm trying to make here is that despite a tendency for academics to have associated so-called virtual worlds with ideas of disembodiment, online wayfaring, to extend the application of Ingold's concept, is intimately bound up with the habitual movement of human hands, involving deft movements of the fingers or digits on keyboards and various touch-sensitive devices. Of course, nowadays we include all of these things like iPods, iPads, and so on. There are digital orientations of two closely related kinds in everyday media use today. And finally, by the way, I should add that I prefer to speak of this feeling a way through in terms of orientation as opposed to navigation. Because that word navigation, for me, is too much associated with cartographic representation and with the notion of a cognitive map. Okay.
There we go. Right, I would now like to introduce our second speaker on this panel, Nick Couldry. Nick is Professor and also Joint Head of Department of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths, University of London, and Nick is also incoming Professor of Media, Communication and Social Theory at the London School of Economics. Nick is, of course, author of many books, just to name a couple: Media, Society, World, Social Theory and Digital Media Practice, and Why Voice Matters, Culture and Politics After Neoliberalism. And Nick is going to be presenting a paper entitled Phenomenology and Critique, Why We Need a Phenomenology of the Digital World. Nick.
Well, thanks very much, Scott and Tim, for organising this really much-needed event. If you don't mind me saying so, I'm already looking forward to conditions of mediation too. Maybe someone else will have to get involved in the organising, but it's a terrific idea. Okay, so I'm not strictly a phenomenologist, but my work is informed by phenomenology at various points. It's extremely important to me in certain ways. So I am interested in the question of what's at stake in a phenomenology of the digital world, or which might lead to the question, going back to Paddy's talk, what counts as the mundane in that digital world, and how naturally does trust emerge within it? In my talk, I want to try and answer that question, what might be at stake in phenomenology of the digital world, from two contrasting angles. That's all I'll offer. The first will reflect on the recent emergence of normative debate about the digital world and the basis, I think, of such normative debate in new phenomena of entanglement in media, digital media. The second angle will argue for attention to some phenomena of great importance to contemporary social organizations that are completely ignored by some recent sociological claims about the pervasiveness of algorithmic power. That's the second point. In both cases, I'm going to be arguing for the role that phenomenologically informed investigation, maybe not phenomenology as such, can play in resisting accounts of the digital world that are inadequately grounded in its everyday textures. Starting with the normative angle, for decades, researchers in media and cultural studies have been wary of too explicit a normative approach to media, indeed to popular culture. Whether that wariness was helpful or not, in some respects I think it's always been very unhelpful, that wariness has been superseded recently by a turn towards the normative, which has taken two contrasting forms. On the one hand, there's writing that is explicitly worried about the ethical quality of our life within and through media. It must be significant, mustn't it, when early digital designers such as Jaron Lanier in his book You Are Not a Gadget, and leading empirical researchers of our interactions with computer-based virtual worlds such as Sherry Turkle in her book Alone Together, voiced similar concerns about the quality of our life in a digital world. Lanier worries about, quotes, a leaching of empathy and humanity, enhanced by what he vividly calls the drive-by anonymity of an intensely online world. Sherry Turkle, in the introduction to her book, asks what is a classic ethical question. She writes, technology reshapes the landscape of our emotional lives, but is it offering us the lives we want to lead? You can't imagine Aristotle putting it better. Turkle's concern is not with the specifics of what we do with this or that media, but with the whole gestalt, the overall quality, the quality of the overall life process, the overall way of communicating that intensive and continuous exposure to multidirectional communication through digital platforms gets us into. And this concern is new, and it's in strong contrast with, as I said, earlier mainstream discourse about the digital era. And it's also unashamedly paradoxical. Think of her book title, Alone Together. And its urgency comes from registering, I think, a certain pain and puzzlement that accompanies life in the digital era. Turkle ends one chapter with the example of Sanjay, age 16. You may well have read this yourself, but it's worth repeating. This is a 16-year-old who switched off the phone during the interview with Sherry Turkle. Then after the interview, half an hour later, he turns it on again and finds 100 messages on his phone from the interim. And he asks himself quietly, according to Turkle, as he walks away from her, how long do I have to go on doing this? It's a great moment. I think she's right to pick out that sort of pain and puzzlement. We know what he's talking about. So both Lanier and Turkle register the deep shared problems arising from our digital ways of being together, problems that we don't know how to solve. Such normative unease, however, is countered by a very, very different approach, although I think equally normative, if in a closet sort of way, which insists, as Mark Durza has done, that today we live a fully media life, ushering in new normative starting points that make irrelevant our older normative frameworks. Durza's book, I think, is best interpreted as an attempt at a sort of Nietzschean transvaluation of contemporary digital entanglements that dismisses old worries about our life with media based on pre-media ethical reference points and insists that ethically we have to start over. Because, Durza argues, our lives literally are now formed out of our media entanglements without access to any prior set of ethical reference points by which we could claim to judge or criticize those entanglements. I don't want to pursue those ethical reflections today, and if you're interested in my take, which follows Turkle much more than Durza, you can have a look at Chapter 8 of my book, Media, Society, World, and if I can break off for a second, it's available, bizarrely, at a 20% discount, even though it's been on sale for a year, on a leaflet in the room. But the publishers are obviously in a generous mood if you want to buy a copy or a second copy. Anyway, instead, in keeping with today's theme, I want to stay with the phenomenological background that I read into these normative debates. Their basis, in a sense, that what habitually we are doing has started to change, perhaps fundamentally, through the supersaturation of our life worlds with media and digital communications of all sorts. Put another way, behind this normative turn lies a set of questions about what we are doing in the digital world that can only be answered, and here I strongly agree with Paddy, by an attention to the phenomena. There's no other way to start thinking about these questions. In Chapter 2 of Media Society World, I offer a provisional list of some striking practices within the digital world that I think we need to notice. Practices of searching, showing, archiving, presencing, and so on. I won't go into those either, but underlying that list is a sense that the coordinates of our daily actions, the dimensions of our daily world, have somehow, in some respects, been altered. Accelerated internet access as we move or stay still means that at almost every point in space and every moment in time, we're potentially in touch with what is happening at every other point in space and time. And we're able to draw on a vast cache of information from the past or the present. And this changes potentially quite radically our possibilities for acting in the world and for interacting with each other. This shifting phenomenology can be summed up in some seemingly simple questions, which are important because there are no longer simple answers to them anymore. But they're questions which we're in effect answering de facto through new practices or perhaps new inflections of older practices. Questions such as, where is this? What scale can I act on here? What others elsewhere can act on me as I stay here? This question of location underlies new practices that in Chapter 2 of my book I call showing and presencing. Or the question, when is this? What informational reserves from the past or the present can I draw on right now? What time or times in the future will this action prove significant for? This question of temporality underlies new practices such as archiving, as I call it in the book. And it links to the concerns we all, of course, have, particularly, for example, when we're on social media, about who in the future might search for what we're doing and sharing right now. And then there's a third, perhaps less naive sounding, but equally open question, which emerges from the first two, which is, what is the order in this set of actions I'm involved in? Who or what has power over or through that order? The question of order links to the emerging norms of digital practice, norms of connection, the compulsion to be connected all the time, norms of mutual surveillance. In the digital world, a key source of unease, whether or not it emerges in explicit normative reflection, is the sense that digital tools are necessarily entangled in distant processes, powerful processes that we cannot unpick or easily challenge. All tools, of course, involve mechanisms, as Paddy was saying earlier, whose details we forget in the act of using the tool or perhaps never knew. We may be able to guess how a hammer has been put together, but these days most of us know nothing about how the modern car that we drive is put together. Yet both hammer and car are tools of everyday living, and our knowledge or ignorance of those tools' workings is not crucial to the quality of our use of the tool or the quality of our wider lives. But digital tools are different. Many of today's digital tools, for example, the platforms that we use for presencing, as I call it, maintaining our presence to distant others, are different from this. These tools are tools that, as part of the very same process by which we use them, are also in the act of using us. They track our actions. Well, that's fine, you might say. Perhaps if it's just to improve the functioning of the tool itself, to enable the tool to work better for us. I certainly needed the computer that I used to write up these notes to remember what I was typing as I typed it. But what we're looking at is something rather different phenomenologically if the tracking involved is designed to generate data, not for our use, but for others' use. And if, even more disturbingly, that others' use, those others' use involves categorizing us and our practices so that we can be better targeted by the instrumental practices of still others, particularly advertisers and marketers. If you believe, as I do, that categorization is an important element of how the social world is ordered, how it emerges as an order that we can inhabit as such, and of course there's the whole tradition of work from Durkheim, Mauss, Bourdieu, tobacco, and Starr, if you believe that, then it is striking, a striking phenomenon, we might say, when the tools that we find in Heidegger's term ready to hand, such as our Facebook page, are, when we consider their practical basis, better understood as tools whereby we, or rather the uniquely identifying data that we continuously generate, become ready to hand to others. Not just other persons, but commercial forces that exist to sell that data to still others who we may not know, but who are already focused on knowing us in order to categorize us algorithmically, categorize us in ways that will affect our conditions of action. One way of developing this is to consider the implications of such categorizations for other pre-existing types of social categories, race, class, gender, and so on. And phenomenology has never come free of an entanglement in those sort of issues, as Sarah Ahmed's work on phenomenology reminds us. But for this talk, I want to stay on a more general phenomenological point, the phenomenon that we deal with every day of what we might crudely call tool reversibility. The case of the tool that in our act of using it has already used us. This aspect of our digital tools is not immediately apparent when we use them. Take the Facebook platform. Its role in monitoring us is certainly not the face that Facebook wants to show us. This is something that we have to learn by drawing on, for example, the discoveries of those who've researched the workings of that tool, the economic models that drive it, researchers such as Jose van Dyke in her great new book, The Culture of Connectivity, and also by drawing on many other public and personal sources. And here I want to thank Daniel Knapp, who's speaking later today, for the inspiration of his current doctoral research on this topic. What I call tool reversibility is a key starting point for our puzzlement in the digital world. Indeed, Lanier's emphatic title, "You Are Not a Gadget," embodies a challenge precisely to such reversals. And this takes me to the second angle from which I want to argue for the importance of a phenomenological approach to researching the digital world, which is the project I'm starting to call social analytics, appropriating Adobe's term. I haven't consulted them yet. Actually, I don't plan to. This social analytics, on the face of it, emerges from a very different direction from the first way into phenomenology, but it too has strong implications, I think, for a contemporary phenomenology, which I'll explain. This approach starts from the practical fact, obvious to all of us, that any public entity today, individual, group, cooperative, setup, startup, conglomerate, any public entity today must, to exist, have a digital presence, web pages and so on, and it must monitor the effect of that presence. In other words, those entities must be open, whether they want to or not, to considering and addressing the effectiveness of that digital presence and how that digital presence gets measured by themselves and others. That's where the analytics comes in. So any social actor, that is, any actor with social ends or needs, in order to serve well those ends, has to develop a reflective relationship towards those analytics. And that reflective relationship has the potential to change how it and they act in the world by designing and customizing the analytics, by adjusting it or their actions and presence in the light of the analytics. And how it or they do those adjustments, how they live with analytics, is what I call the project of social analytics. Basically, the sociological study of how analytics get used by a range of actors, not simply instrumentally to serve directly commercial interests. Social analytics as a field of research is not concerned with the obvious ways of making money out of analytics. We know about those. But it's concerned instead with the use of analytics towards fulfilling separate, non-technical, non-instrumental goals that aim to enable an organization to be simply what it wants to be, to have a certain digital presence that serves that end. This idea of social analytics has been developed in our research team at Goldsmiths, who've been working on action research in Salford in the north of England. We've been working with various community actors, schools, colleges, a community centre, community reporter organisation. The term social analytics suddenly emerged out of our work with some of those community actors, where we were looking at how digital infrastructures of various sorts support new forms of storytelling, new forms of exchanging stories, and therefore exchanging knowledges. And this project is called the Story Circle Project, which was named using the term developed by the founder of the digital storytelling movement, Joe Lambert from Berkeley. That's the project webpage. So why might social analytics, in my sense, not Adobe's, be interesting for researchers, and what might it have to do with phenomenology? You might think I'm branching off in some irrelevant topic here. Well, there are basically two reasons. One is theoretical and one is empirical, more empirical. Theoretically, because this approach challenges a recent trend in digital sociology. I'm thinking particularly of the work of my Goldsmith colleague Scott Lash, which says that the embedding of algorithms in everyday life literally collapses epistemology, the knowledge that underlies the structuring and use of those algorithms, down into ontology, the way things are, the brute reality for all of us. That's from a piece in 2009. And writers such as Lash see power now as working through the algorithm in a sort of lockdown model which leaves none of us as agents any chance at all to challenge or contest how we are labelled, how we are measured, no chance to reflect on the form and parameters of our digital presence, let alone take a normative stance about the means and ends of that digital presence. But in my view, this type of digital sociology is just wrong. It's a complete misreading of what's going on. It's blind, in fact, to whole new areas of important and contested agency that are at the heart of what contemporary organisations on all sizes and scales are now involved with. It basically erases the complex reflexive relationship that actors, all actors, potentially now have to the digital infrastructure through which, in large part, they are sustained. I'll just give you the types of things you might study in pursuing social analytics, which is I call a sort of phenomenology. I'll justify that in a moment. We're concerned here, for example, with how content is captured and stored and archived by social actors, how they think about that process of storing and archiving, how then others get enabled to access that content, prioritizing particular contents rather than others, what adjustments then that social actor feels able to make when they review how others have used their content, how they visualize the data to encourage different types of narrative that involve re-narrativizations of their presence, and how and to what extent new ways of organizing that content and data get opened up to reflection for the first time from a social or cultural organization's users or constituencies through the way that things are re-narrated, based in turn on analytics built about how people move around the site that constitutes that entity's digital presence. Now, this might sound like a purely descriptive agenda, but I think that such stories, reflections, and adjustments, reflexive adjustments, are at the heart of how social actors today maintain a presence and pursue their goals in the world. They are, I suggest, part of a phenomenology of complex actors today. Indeed, I'd argue that all actors today are complex in the sense that they carry with them and need to sustain around them and around their actions algorithmically based narratives about themselves whose quality as narrative affects how they are able to act in the world, because it affects how they're interpreted and categorized by themselves and by others. One of the most important analyses here, incidentally, in terms of the implications of digital information for the very nature of institutions, is Bruce Bimber's fine work on the implications of digital archiving for political organizations in his book Information and American Democracy. But I think it has implications also for all types of institution, and maybe even for individuals too. So, concluding, if we take seriously the possibility that the automated digital tools that measure what we do and how we are in the online world are a key part of everyday life's background and could become part of what we can, under certain circumstances, confront in dealing with the world, then phenomenology has become both more complex, more imbued with normative uncertainty, and necessarily entangled in a wider range of empirical inquiry than can be revealed easily and directly to reflection. There is therefore no bracketing out of the consequences for our actions of these unseen algorithmic tools which measure us. But it's absurd to deny that everyday actors are involved today in attempting to bring into their everyday awareness the workings of those tools. Phenomenology becomes, in this particular sense, a newly difficult object of struggle in the digital world, and as such, a commitment to a phenomenological perspective has never been more important for the future of critical research into our mediated lives. Without its impetus, we might already have accepted Lash's peremptory statement that algorithmic power literally collapses epistemology into ontology, collapsing the very possibility of reflexivity, and so the starting point for phenomenological questions in the first place. We have to insist, as phenomenologists, or those who are at least informed and inspired by phenomenology, that this sociological dictum is just wrong and exactly misses some of the most important struggles that social actors face today. Thanks.
Got water as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. This is beautiful. Okay. And now I'd like to introduce our final speaker on this panel, David Berry. David Berry is incoming reader in media and cultural studies at the University of Sussex, and author of such books as Critical Theory and the Digital, Understanding Digital Humanities, and The Philosophy of Software, Code and Mediation in the Digital Age. And David's paper is entitled Phenomenological Approaches to the Computal, Some Reflections on Computation.
So this really is some new work that I'm doing. Do I need to speak into the mic? Is it a problem for recording? Great. Oh, that's great. Okay, great. Here I'm quite interested in exploring what I'm increasingly calling the computal, both in terms of a kind of phenomenology and its particularity and temporality, but also how the computal itself is instantiated and articulated through different technical moments, as it were. So really what I want to do here is to sort of start to outline some of my thoughts around this notion of the computal, but also think about how it plays out in particular contexts, and here I'm thinking particularly in terms of streaming technologies. And really, what I'm trying to get to grips with really is this notion of algorithmic mediation. And some of the questions have been raised by the previous speakers. I mean, it's quite interesting, actually, having listened to the other speakers and seeing the continuity, I think, with what I want to talk about here. Part of the reason I do this, really, is because of what I think are the limitations of the concept of the digital. Right? The digital, I think, is a problematic term in many ways. And so by using the term the computer, I think it signifies the importance of computation itself, above and beyond that of the mere digital, as it were. And also, I want to sort of highlight that computation itself is not purely digital. Right? Computation has a number of different forms, and that we need to take account of this if we're going to have some understanding of computation and how it plays out in particular contexts, the digital being one of those moments, as it were. So again, I mean, this is very tentative, but what I'm trying to think of really is the computer as a kind of constellation of computationals, perhaps, as a kind of constellation of concepts around the computational, and how the computation itself is an extremely complex manifestation. Thus, in some ways, perhaps we can explore the cadences of the computal as well as specific moments, and think then, to think more in a kind of phenomenological sense about the kind of logics of attention, the particular computals, as it were, bring forward. So, some of the things that the computer, I think, interestingly brings to the table is a number of kind of theoretical presuppositions, right? So clearly, right, immediately when we talk about the computer, we're talking about the possibility of computability itself, right? That's an important first point. The computer also is formalizable in terms of, for example, Turing machines, lambda calculus, and combinatory logic, right? These are the kind of underlying conditions of possibility for computation itself. And then these formalizable forms are then materialized in particular ways, and the materializations themselves may be abstracted. I mean, this is one of the paradoxes, I think, of the computational. The key point really is that, we're not just talking about the informational symbolic, we're also talking about the material, and that's crucially important, and we have to think about that in the way in which we see the computational in everyday life. So if we need to think about a phenomenology of the computal then, how do we then draw attention to kind of specific moments of that materialization, right? What I might call the computum, the specific instantiation, and how that specific instantiation is then experienced. So this draws interesting conclusions, I think, or interesting ways of thinking about this. For example, lambda calculus itself is not a screenic form of computation, right? Lambda calculus is undertaken, on paper. So it's a computational form that's extremely paper-based. And so the phenomenology of a particular form of computation need not necessarily be itself screenic. And so this really is to kind of get us to think about the difficulty of understanding the equipmental, as we might call it, in relation to these computational devices. Right? There's a range of equipment around and in the computational. The second thing I think is quite important to think about, if we think about that as one axis perhaps, is that there's also an interesting laminate structure to the computational or the computal. Right? The computal is built in layers, right? This kind of layering structure is hugely important to understanding the computal. And there are different, or that's perhaps a question, how particular moments in that layering structure, the different levels of the laminate, as it were, are experienced phenomenologically, right? And I think that's an interesting research question for doing a kind of phenomenology of the computal. So how, for example, and this is very much a question, how might those various instantiations of computal logic play out at different levels? How do we experience them, right? And that's hugely important because when we deal with the equipmental form of computing, we're dealing with different layers of the computational, right? And increasingly, one of the most important things about phenomenologies of computation is this experience of multiply layered technologies, right? Computational systems build on computational systems, which build on computational systems, right? And it's very important to take account of the way in which actors experience that. And so perhaps we might think about the way in which we could map the computal on a kind of mode versus laminate structure. But I'll leave that for you to do, as it's definitely quite difficult to actually think through, I think. So the computal then presents an interesting case for what we might call intentional orientations, right? So the significance of equipment that shows up for a particular purpose related to computation. What is the equipment which we are experiencing? And it also raises interesting questions about the kind of comportment one might have to a computational device, right? And how one's project, as it were, influences and affects the phenomenological experience of that computational device, right? And why I kind of labour that point a little bit is because of the fact that computational devices are highly plastic, right? So the equipmental form is not necessarily given. Those affordances are complexified by the plasticity of software and algorithms themselves. That clearly, and we all know this from our everyday experience of these devices, they adapt function, you know, depending on, for example, a secondary context, which may itself be unknown to the user themselves, right? Which is an interesting aspect. And of course, there are fascinating feedback loops that occur there too, as Nick was referring to, whereby the device watches the user and tries to second guess the user in action. So this notion of ready-to-handness, I suppose, right, in a sort of practical intentionality, kind of is problematized, I think, in the context of the computational device, right? Particularly if we think of the computational device at any particular moment as being, in a certain sense, radically undecidable, right? The software, the algorithm, has a certain amount of agency in its presentation of its surface. The other interesting dimension, I think, again, is very Heideggerian, is this notion that the computational device not only may change function mid-use, which is a kind of breakdown moment, right, but also may actually break down. So we experience this breakdown of computation, the failing Wi-Fi network, the literal crash of your phone, the pausing of the system and the incomprehensibility that creates. Next, I think we might think about perhaps the computal categorical intuition that, you know, allows us in a certain sense to apprehend the categorical structure of objects themselves, right, and how the computer sort of structures our expectations, shall we say, of the object itself, right, and it's never straightforward in the computer. And of course, the computer itself, right, is instantiated in a world, which, as Paddy rightly says, is increasingly algorithmic itself, right? In many ways, the computer is built on these kind of shifting sands of a computational world. So how is the computer embedded into everyday life, right? And how do algorithms function to suggest and make possible practices associated with it are key kind of questions to explore. So we might, for example, to think back about this question of the equipmental qualities of the computational device, that in a certain sense, if we think of the computum as a kind of, you know, a deep quality of the computer, how does it announce itself, right? That announcement of the computum is itself performed by a secondary moment. There's a secondary surface, as it were, right? What we might call appearance, I suppose, but the computational interface as standing in for the computer in some sense, right? When we use these interfaces, we're not necessarily directly using the algorithm, right? There's a loose coupling, as it were, between these moments. And so how to trace these moments, these conditions of possibility for the computer is an interesting question, right? Especially when certain technologies are black boxed, right? Where our researchers can only move so far. And this, I think, presents some of the difficulties of engaging with a kind of phenomenology of the computer as such. So to do this, if I can indeed do this, I want to sort of explore a paradigmatic example of the computer, right? Namely streams. Right? Streams as a manifestation of particular computational, theoretical and empirical moment. So the aim, as I say, is twofold. I want to explore the form of computal experience that is highly computal itself, but it's also, I think, interestingly, one to which contemporary media is turning, right? The media industry is increasingly turning to the streaming as a means of, in some sense, perhaps mitigating the digital and the problems of the digital, right? And so the stream is quite interesting, both as a computal moment and as a computational imaginary, right? It has certain promises and there are certain political, economic consequences of this streaming format. And of course, I think the stream itself is really rich as a form of phenomenological study, right? It's an interesting form of media in itself. So, just obviously in this very limited time, I have to kind of breeze over this, so I'll try to see what I can cover. But essentially, streams are, connected with notions of calculation, organization, and speed, right? These issues are hugely important in streams. In streams, everything conforms, we could say, to the current state of calculation, right? The calculation, the algorithm, is the passageway by which media and data move. So the basis of priority in streams is it's self-organized, hugely important, right? There are logistics that structure and order the stream, right? It's not a random process, although you could have a kind of random algorithm, but that itself would be algorithmic, of course. And streams are associated with speed and technical velocities, right? Which, quoting Heidegger, though he's not obviously talking about streams from a different context, create a kind of mania for the surprising, for what is again and again immediately and differently striking and enthralling, right, unquote. So this has sometimes been talked about, well, in my own work I talk about this kind of Twitter trance, right, so this notion of a kind of trance before a fast-flowing stream of information. So why is the stream interesting? Well, the stream's interesting because fundamentally for, computational devices, particularly materialized computational, input-output, which is the very possibility of interactivity with, our phenomenal world, is understood as a stream, right? Computers see the world as streams. And this has presented particular kinds of problems for the designers of computers, because streams are pretty difficult to handle, and I think conceptually have perhaps been difficult for us to deal with. And so there have been ways in computation of essentially transforming the stream into objects, so that we are increasingly used to using objects in related to the computational. However, this question of the turn to the stream means a turn away from computational objects as such, right? And what are the consequences of that, both in terms of computation and the computer, but also a phenomenology of computational streaming interfaces, right? i.e. using certain kinds of media that are themselves streamed. So I'm not going to go through these things, but I just want to show you the formal kind of logic that's used to understand streams. So streams essentially are functions that map time onto data, right? And as you can imagine, this is intended to be infinite, right? There's an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of data, but it's discrete. So you can see at the bottom where you get those discrete moments in a stream, right? But at any point, importantly, an algorithm can map time onto a piece of data, right, and present it to you. So this kind of formal property of streams, this abstract property of streams, then has to be translated in some sense to an algorithmic model. And interestingly, the algorithmic model is built around what computer scientists think is a model of the human mind, human consciousness, and the way in which mind itself functions, which is, I think, interesting. But essentially, the model is made of past, present, and future, right? And streams are algorithmically divided, I suppose, in some sense, or can be categorized by the way in which they use those different structures to move through data and present it to the user, right? Generally speaking, the past doesn't matter to streams, which I think is really interesting about streams themselves. And the reason for that is because of the speed, right? Streams are all about speed and low latency, right? And of course, the moment you have fast-flowing data, you are really restricting what you might do to it. And why I think streams are also very interesting is that streams also, perhaps, solve a problem of orientation, right, in computational societies. How is one to orient oneself? Well, the streams answer that, and streaming technologies, with the answer towards the future, right? One orients oneself to the future flow of data, not the past, the future. So for example, this is a very quick typology to give some idea, but essentially, if we use latency as a kind of categorization scheme, we get these kind of high latency streams, very slow flowing streams, and they can have the past. They can reflect on the past in some sense. There is the possibility of algorithmic processing of that past. The middle latency streams are the kind of non-archival ones. There's no memory, but there's a kind of windowing, right? The kind of, if you like, there's a kind of possibility of reflection algorithmically on the data that's coming through. And then finally, we move to the kind of low latency streams, the short or non-window streams, very much built around atomic calculation, limited algorithmic, but also incredibly fast, right? And Twitter kind of lies very much, I would say, between the low latency and middle latency, probably more towards the low latency. Facebook itself is probably somewhere between the middle and the high latency in the way in which it structures data today. This streaming technology obviously raises questions of informational overload, right? These are a common problem in computational systems, and also reconciliation itself. How does one deal with streams, but not just single streams, but multiple streams at any moment? And there's a kind of interesting phenomenology of that. So, Gelernter, whose name I can never pronounce, interestingly argues that computers in the past dealt with numbers and words, right? Today they deal mainly with pictures. We have our desktops, etc. And he argues in the new period they will deal with time, with streams. So this idea of streams, and I want to kind of highlight that, it's not, oh sorry, how long was that? 2 minutes, right, great, thanks. It's not about just an interface, right? This is not an interface question. This is the fundamental, this is why I was showing you the formal lambda calculus. This is a completely different way of understanding computation itself and the computational problematics, right? So this is a move to a whole different premise of how computers are structured, right? It's massive infrastructural changes. So that streams are organized and organizing through these computal models of past, present, and future, and implemented obviously in algorithms, right? And these play out in interesting ways. And Gelernter, interestingly, was the computer scientist targeted by the Unabomber, right, for being one of the biggest threats to civilization. He actually lost an eye. So his ideas were thought and are thought, interesting in this regard. And just to get you a sense of scale, right, we're talking huge amounts of data passing through these streaming technologies. So Twitter users send over 400 million tweets per day. That's 16 million tweets per hour, right? You can imagine this is just phenomenal amounts of stuff. There isn't time to think it through. It literally is just presented in this ongoing flow of information. And this results, in some senses, with a rather interesting phenomenological experience of the streaming technologies, of a kind of trance, of a kind of futurity, where one watches the Twitter stream, right? And in a certain sense, just lungs towards a kind of future. Right, I'm running out of time, so I'm very aware that I'm running out of time, so I want to try and get to the end points. Just to kind of draw it to a conclusion, streams are then a case of a kind of built or being built in the process of construction computational architecture. And I think that's really interesting because for media theorists, media analysts, I think it's interesting to see the construction of something that is not yet settled, right? The computer streaming technologies are still radically open in interesting ways. And offer sites for intervention, I think, as well. So there are lots of questions around, what we'll do with streams and how they work, etc., etc., and clearly how they will structure. Will be interesting to see how they play out. And I think really, the question I want to leave you with is how these streams institute a certain kind of ethos, right? A certain kind of way of relating to the contemporary and everyday way of thinking and feeling and so on and so forth. But also this interesting aspect of the kind of messianic that streaming kind of engenders, which is a kind of form of waiting. Streaming phenomenology seems to me, in any sense, as they're currently implemented, one built around waiting. Thank you.
Right, well, I'd just like to thank all three of our speakers for excellent presentations. They're very stimulating, thought-provoking, and I'm sure generative of more questions than we can possibly discuss here. But we do have some time for discussions. And like in the previous session, we'd like to begin by asking our speakers if they have any questions for their fellow speakers.
Oh, could you, in non-technical terms, define the stream? Because it sometimes sounded like a technical term coming out of computational science that have a very complex. Other times it sounded more straightforwardly phenomenological, that it was some sort of perhaps algorithmically based slice through all the things going on in the computer, which you slice on a timeline. So a whole series of the same type of thing going on along a timeline. And the question is how, what's the same type of thing? But could you just help?
Yeah, maybe if I gave two definitions. I mean, technically, a stream is an infinite list ordered by time of items. And in terms of phenomenological definition, I think it's a kind of processual way of presenting information or experiencing information as a flow, in some sense.
Right. So that's the time of the computation, when the computation occurs. Right. Good.
Any other questions? Sean, David?
I suppose if I'm honest, I'm struck by the differences, really, and maybe struggling to see the links between the kind of thing that I'm up to, the kind of concern with bodily movements and with, the inhabiting of environments, and the kind of thing that, interesting as it is, the kind of thing that David and Nick are up to, and I suppose I feel a little bit puzzled to be on the same panel. I'm delighted to be, but in the sense that, just speaking from the point of view of my own interests, David's stuff, I was struck by one or two things. That you mentioned at one point the question of comportment in relation to computational devices. And at another moment later in your talk, you spoke about the matter of orientation. But I suppose from my perspective, I didn't really get much sense of, I suppose, what you might call the warmth of everyday practice and experience. And I suppose I was struggling a little with the kind of if you like, the detail of the computational stuff, because that's not really my thing. In Nick's paper, I suppose I feel kind of closer in many ways to the kind of thing that Nick was talking about. But one thing that worried me a little bit, Nick, was you used the term supersaturation early on, and we've talked before, actually, the last time we met, about Mark Durz's work and his kind of thesis in the Media Life book. And one of the slight concerns I have with Durz's work is I wonder whether there's a danger of a certain kind of media centrism there. This notion that, the notion that our lives are made out of our media entanglements. And you mentioned the notion of the compulsion to connection in terms of, say, internet use. But I wondered about, what Deirdre Bowden and Harvey Moloch years ago called the compulsion to proximity, and the kind of, the importance of, the continuing importance of kind of physically co-present intimacy and experiences of touch and of, if you like, talk in face-to-face interaction. And I suppose my comment has become rather longer than I intended it to be at the start. But I suppose on my feet I'm trying to wonder, like, how what I'm up to kind of connects with what you're up to.
Yeah. So, in regard to kind of warmness, which I think is interesting in itself as a kind of normative term, you know, I think the difficulty at the moment, I mean, this is kind of early work and thinking through and drilling into this notion of streams, is that obviously, you know, I'm drilling down to both kind of genealogies of streams, but also getting my head around these kind of, you know, symbolic forms and, you know, the kind of early histories of these algorithms, etc., which I think obviously comes out in the way in which I present it. But clearly the kind of warmness, as you call it, is going to be crucially important, right? These streaming experiences, which are going to be these devices, as it were, forming part of your life, perhaps as being a kind of personal assistant. We could think of, for example, Google Now, which tries to present a certain kind of warmness towards you, a kind of friend-like interface, a knowledge of you in yourself and your practices, you know, and your bodily practices, you know, where you move and how you move, your favourite coffees and so on and so forth. These are obviously issues that I think are being explored in relation to, you know, the computational and particularly streaming. Yeah, so I think that that's an interesting point. Yeah.
I don't think there's such disagreement in that all of us agree in embodiedness, right, of what we're talking about. But there's a huge difference in what we're emphasising, clearly. I mean, to be honest, I don't know what you mean by the warmth. As a single thing, the warmth of every day. I don't know what you mean by that. I mean, there are clearly bits and pieces here and there we might say, but I don't believe that that's an object that could help orient us in research. I think it's too scattered. But let's leave that to one side. But just come back on your point. Of course, we don't want a media-centric approach. All my work for 15 years has been emphasising that. And but let's clarify supersaturation. And I agree that Mark Durzer this is the problem. I strongly disagree with Mark's approach, lively and entertaining though it is. I think it's fundamentally wrong, precisely because it closes down the very areas of ethical questioning, or put it differently, reflexivity that are essential to a phenomenological approach. I think it's profoundly wrong. But supersaturation is a term that Todd Gitlin introduced into media studies in 2001. I think he was right to do so, pointing to not just there being a lot of media around, which would be saturation, but supersaturation, although he doesn't technically define it, and I'm no chemist, is a term from chemistry. I explain this in the book, having looked it up through Wikipedia. Without Wikipedia, I couldn't even known what it meant. But supersaturation is something like where you have a solution that has more in it of a certain substance, dissolving substance, than can actually stably be dealt with by the liquid. And the important point about supersaturation is not a stable state. It's a state in between. And the point, I only use the term in the book to say it could be, and this is where I think ethics comes in an unstable state between a lot of media building up and us gradually getting a stable way of selecting from that so that we can deal with this. So that's the way. I'm not saying that it's media. On the contrary, I think we're moving towards a radical form of selection within this environment, which will put us in 10, 20 years' place in a different place. And apps are one way we're building interfaces for doing that or being helped to do so. So I don't think we actually have a disagreement there. But I think on the embodiment, I think obviously we put the emphasis somewhere differently, but embodiment definitely comes in. You know, let's just think about it straightforwardly. If we're dealing with information overloads, Sunday evening, after a great weekend away, embodied on the beach or wherever, you know, you come home and you make the terrible mistake of switching on the computer or the BlackBerry to see just if there's one interesting email from a friend saying hi. And there's 100 boring administrative emails that you are drawn into. Now, that is bodily. We know that pain. And we know sometimes how our reaction to the pain causes us to do quite drastic things with a device that's given us that phenomenon. So there's no real I just think we put the emphasis very, very differently. And I think we're dealing with far more conflict at the moment. It's far more puzzlement about what is going on in our lives than your account would seem to emphasize. That's, I think, the area of disagreement, if there is one.
I can just add, I mean, I think that point about reflexivity is hugely important, not something I really talked about in my slides due to just limitation of space, but, you know, streams are an answer to that, what you might call supersaturation. Paradoxically, that more information through a streaming form, which creates a kind of homogeneity of different media forms, allows the possibility of algorithmic curation, and that curation creates, you know, space, as you say, for, well, this is the question, for reflexivity.
It's one of the questions, and I'm sure our audience have questions as well. We do have time for a few. So you, sir, were first. Mohsen, if you wouldn't mind. And then back and just here.
Thank you. Patrick Krogan from University of West of England, sort of media cultural theory. Hey, thanks a lot for the panel, folks. Really interesting. And Nick, I was going to kind of ask a question around that point you just made about. To me, the tension between the presentations was more about Sean positing a kind of stability, right, inhabiting a being. Kind of memory. Then, with that position, then you understand that the human, there's no essential human, there's no essential that homeless being human. Disorientation is a kind of visionary condition, and we metastabilize certain being at homes. And we're in a situation now where we have a strong sense that we're in more disoriented, not exactly metastabilized.
Okay. Just collect a few. Mohsen, just to your left, woman with the laptop there. Stop. Yes? You had a question?
It's Alison.
Alison Howell, I'm at the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics. My question is for David, and it's a question about the transformation of the stream in between the ways that the stream is imagined by computer scientists, and I wanted to connect to your point about the calculus. I have to admit this is the second time that I've seen a version of this talk, so maybe I'm like picking up more. And then the way that is, the space and disconnect between the ways that the stream is considered by its creators and the ways that the stream is experienced, and then sort of wanted to kind of bring back the question of whether these are two phenomenologies, and this kind of connects with what Lisa was talking about, different types of work and different types of infrastructure in a way. So what does the stream look like phenomenologically to its creators, and how is that different than how it appears to the people who are using it? Because we talked about the experience of waking, but I feel like the computer scientists think of the stream as a very different thing that you are not waiting for.
Okay, and finally, right in the back row.
My name is Peter Rocha. I'm from McEwen University in Edmonton, Canada. I'm in the Bachelor of Communication Studies program. And this kind of builds as a bridge from the first keynote address, and also the idea of orientation versus disorientation. I'm just interested in double movements and reversals. So one paper talks about a homeliness, comfort, and habitation. Then the other sense that we get is that the digital is also a site for potential invasion or a threat. I'm interested in that in terms of identity formation, that when you're talking about jazz improvisation and the keys, or the fingers upon the keyboard, there's a sense in which you can lose yourself yourself within jazz, within computer games, within the stream of Twitter. And then on the other side of the algorithms, it seems almost as if the algorithms can potentially be a site where you can find yourself, because, let's say, Facebook will either tell you who you are in terms of your profile and suggestion, or anticipate what you want. So I'm wondering how both of those can exist simultaneously within the digital or the digital.
That's great. Thanks very much. Sean, would you like to go first?
I'm not familiar with the stuff that you're referencing, to be honest. But are you saying that disorientation is kind of central to experience? Because, I mean, my interest, I suppose, my central interest is in questions of the everyday. And it seems to me that what's fundamental about our movement and our inhabiting of everyday environments is that we do know our whereabouts, and we do know where we're headed. And, you know, if you like, what Tim Ingold calls everyday skills of orientation are surely kind of crucial to our kind of ordinary doings and gettings around. And so, I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about the you know, the stuff that you're talking about, but I don't know. I'm struggling to see how. I mean, my everyday experience, I don't think is about disorientation at all.
Can I come in there?
Yeah, please.
I think that's something we would agree. And that, I mean, Stiegler's notion of technicity is an important contribution. I agree with you there. But that's a bit different from the idea, and I don't know whether he said this or was your gloss on him, that disorientation is fundamental. Because that's where I would agree about the consensus with Paddy as well, that the whole point of the phenomenological approach and Heidegger's work and why it's important is to pay attention to the necessity of us sharing an orientation to the world, which is based in our embodied nature, in time and so on. It's impossible to make sense of the project called life, except if there isn't a commonality of a certain level of shared orientation. It just doesn't make sense. So I don't know what fundamental disorientation can mean. Originary. Well, again, originary, then for me that obviously says something important about the technicity. And as I said, that's important. But that's all it says, as far as I can see. And that's, to be honest, I have tried to read Stiegler, and I got that out of it, and then I didn't get any further. You probably got further than me. And I'd be interested to know what else there is in Stiegler. But for me, the essential thing to draw when we use philosophy is to draw from it concepts that enable us to make distinctions. Approaches which are broad enough to orientate us to a very wide range of questioning that we need to be sensitive to, but then to be able to make actual distinctions between different states, different types of processes. For me, the originary technicity idea, interesting though it is in other contexts, I can't see how I can work with it in the sort of situations that Sean and I might or might not agree upon in the field. I just don't know what I can do with it, to be honest. David.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that, but I would like to move to Alison's question, if that's okay, where I think that's a really, interesting question, and obviously having seen the other version of the presentation, you'd be aware that part of the work is a kind of a look at how early conceptualizations of these streaming forms were made up, and I think it's an interesting question to what kind of phenomenology there is for those early originators in the 1960s over technologies, or rather theoretical constructions of technologies that were not then possible to build. And so I kind of tried to touch on this when I talked about different kind of phenomenologies for different instantiations of the computal. But you're right, different streams I think would also have that. And so just kind of like to give it a go, it was quite an interesting thought experiment. I mean, what does strike me about the computer scientists in the 1960s is they're fascinated by this notion of infinity and the experience of infinity. And so streams were a way of them to talk about an infinite data set or an infinite period of time and to think theoretically about how that might be manipulated. And I think there's interesting, you know, an interesting phenomenology of perhaps mastery and control in relation to the possibility of doing that stuff. But also, I think, in kind of a contemporary manifestations of streams, I think that's a different kind of phenomenology for the computer scientists and the creators of these kind of streams. Although I think there also is a kind of mastery, because they control the streams and they control the algorithms. They understand how they can use those stream transformation algorithms in interesting ways. So they have a feeling of power and control. In relation to the users, again, that's really, really fascinating, because clearly these streaming technologies are in the process of being built and also in the process of shifting. So Twitter's a great example of this, where the kind of subject of Twitter has itself undergone a transformation from the Twitter user as a very active, interactive experience to that of an increasingly audience-like passivity. What we might call a kind of active passivity that Twitter would like to encourage, which has resulted in a kind of contestation over that stream itself by users, etc. And some people have fled Twitter to app.net, for example, where they feel that that has a better experience. And so this notion of waiting, which I was thinking particularly in relation to Twitter, was that. So I think that's a very interesting point. Thank you.
Right, well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for now.